Hey everybody, how's it going? Definitely want to check the audio. I think I might have messed something up with my audio settings here. So somebody let me know if I'm sounding a bit off, like if it's not coming through well. As soon as people start showing up, I don't see anybody yet. So we will wait a bit for people to get here. And in the meantime, I guess I could say hello to everybody. Oh, great. So audio is good. Okay, awesome. All right. So today I am revisiting phenomenal conservatism again. So it's one of my favorite topics. It's actually, excuse me. Let me get a drink. 1 second. Yeah. So it's one of my favorite topics, and it's not one of my favorite topics by choice. I kind of just felt compelled to discuss it because, well, let me just say what phenomenal conservatism is. So it's this idea. Mike Humer has written about it. Probably the most prominent person to have like explicitly written about it and maybe coined the term. So this idea of phenomenal conservatism is basically this sort of modest epistemic principle that does a lot of work. So the idea is that if it seems to you that something is true, in the absence of any reasons to think that it's not true, you're justified in believing that it's true. In other words, the fact that something seems to be true provides some, even if small, degree of evidence in favor of that view. And so long as there's nothing that undercuts that view or nothing that provides better reasons to hold some contrary view that would conflict with that view, you're justified in believing that. And the principle looks modest. And if used in a modest way, if it counts a bit, I think that seems true, but then someone presents a lot of evidence to the contrary, then you overturn the belief. And so, one example of this might be, you look out at the world and you see all the organisms out there. There's cats and birds and dogs and trees and all sorts of living things. And you look at them and you see that they're super complex. And you have that kind of, watchmaker type thing where you're like, wow, these things are really complex. I know that a lot of the really complex things in the world around me have been designed. Maybe these things are designed too. Now, that may or may not have been a reasonable inference to make prior to evolution and natural selection. But once you were presented with overwhelming evidence for natural selection, then that would provide a defeater. Here's a better explanation for why organisms are the way that they are, how they arose, why they differ, how they could be so complex, all that sort of thing. And so, although you might have some degree, if it seems to you that things are designed, okay, fine. In the absence of defeaters, you're justified in believing they're designed. But when you're presented sufficient evidence to conclude that they were not designed, then that overrides it. So that's how phenomenal conservatism is supposed to operate. At least as far as I can tell, that's how it's supposed to operate. But what I've observed in practice is the way it actually seems to function in arguments. Now, when I encounter when you get into an argument with someone, typically what you're expecting them to do, if their goal is to persuade you or to persuade an audience, is to appeal to publicly available information in order to try to say, hey, here, maybe you don't have this information, but here is the information. And so maybe you should adopt this view given this information. Now, that doesn't mean that the person needs to present completely new evidence that no one's ever seen before, like in a courtroom where they're like, here's the murder weapon, and they hold up like a weapon in a bag or something like that. And it's like marked, and it was found at the scene of the crime, and there's witnesses, and it's in a report somewhere. It doesn't have to be like that. They could just say, hey, given the evidence you and I both have access to, some articles that are available online, something like that. So hey, what about this book? They are gathering the evidence or pointing to evidence that you already have access to, and then saying, hey, given this evidence, I think this particular conclusion follows. But in the case of phenomenal conservatism, if something seems true to you, other people don't have access to your phenomenology. Now, if they happen to share your phenomenology, then you could point to your shared phenomenology and then say, hey, like for instance, you and another person are looking at a tree. Hey, it seems to me there's a tree there. So in fact, I could see trees right there. So I'm looking at a tree. I'm literally looking at a tree. Okay. Seems to me there's a tree there. In the absence of defeaters, I'm justified in believing there's a tree. It seems pretty reasonable. I really think there's a tree there. Now, if you were here looking at the tree, in fact, I'm not going to mess with the camera, but if I turn the camera, you could see, maybe you could see some leaves there. So you probably imagine there's a tree right there, right? So you could see the tree too. So if we're both looking at the tree, even though my phenomenology is private and inaccessible to you, and your phenomenology is private and inaccessible to me, we're both agreeing on what we're seeing. And so we're both justified in believing there's a tree there in the absence of defeaters. So phenomenal conservatism does its job. But what would happen if you didn't think there was a tree there, or I didn't think there was a tree there? Well, at that point, I might say, hey, look, let's say you didn't see a tree for whatever reason. Let's say I pointed at a bunch of trees and I was like imagining there's a tree there. Let's say I was pointing out there and I thought there was a tree. There actually wasn't a tree. And you could see that it wasn't a tree, but maybe I'm bad at identifying trees. Who knows? It doesn't have to be a super realistic scenario. So, I look out, I think there's a tree there. You look out there, you don't see a tree, and you're like, yeah, I don't see a tree. Now, are you obligated to believe in a tree because that there is a tree there because I see it and I'm justified in believing how things seem to me? You haven't yet presented any defeaters, right? So we're both looking in the same direction. I see a tree. You don't see a tree. Seems to me there is a tree. Seems to you there isn't a tree. We're both individually justified in believing how things seem to us in the absence of defeaters. We haven't presented any defeaters yet. Okay, so are you obligated to think there's a tree there because it seems to me that there's one? No, right? No, because you're equally justified in believing how things seem to you in the absence of defeaters. Now, that is how the principle is, I think, supposed to operate. Nobody gets to privilege their seemings over anybody else's seemings. But you can see how there are circumstances where this would make for a very strange argumentative move if other people, like in the case of the tree example I gave, don't have access to how things seem to you, if it doesn't seem that way to them. So for instance, suppose I was hiking in the woods and I see some strange creature, maybe there's a flying saucer had crashed and I see glowing aliens, or I see Bigfoot, or I see a unicorn in the middle of the woods, right? Now let's say, I continue on for several hours. Let's say I get a really good look at it. Let's say I even take photos and then I go to sleep and the next day I wake up and I examine the photos and I'm like, oh, I'm going to prove this to everybody. And then somehow I lose, the Bigfoot captures me and smashes my camera and takes the pictures away or something. So like, it's not like I think I saw Bigfoot in the corner of my eye. I had time to review the evidence, and it's really like I get a really good look. So at that point, if I walk back into town, I end my hike, I get back to my car, I'm okay. At that point, I can safely conclude I wasn't hallucinating. I had probably not ingested, some type of poison that maybe hallucinate things. There's a whole bunch of checks I could do where I could be pretty confident. Yeah, I saw what I saw. It might be unbelievable, almost unbelievable, but I could believe it at that point, right? I saw it. I interacted with it. Let's say Bigfoot hung out with me and sat by the campfire, told me about what it's like being a Bigfoot in the woods, So like you have that whole scenario. Now, if I then showed up here and I said, hey, this actually happened, I did see Bigfoot in the woods, are you going to believe me? I mean, some of you might, but a lot of you wouldn't. I know I asked a survey question in the community section some time ago about this. But I suspect, if you don't already have a disposition to think that something like Bigfoot is very likely as a creature to really exist, you're not going to believe me. You're going to think it's more likely that I was hallucinating or that it's an elaborate hoax. Like, especially if I'm doing this because I'm always giving these skeptical examples and all this sort of thing, you might think, if I was like, imagine I actually came on here and I was like, I'm not playing around. I'm not kidding. It's not April 1st. I saw Bigfoot and I like looked serious. And I was like, I know people aren't going to believe me. And like, I did all the things where I seem to be self-aware of how implausible this sounds. Would you believe it? I suspect not. Right. So I wouldn't have the credibility to establish that Bigfoot existed. But let's say it's an ecologist or a biologist or a park ranger who has no history of making this sort of stuff up. And they're like, look, I saw what I saw. For me, I would think just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of evidence that it's certainly more plausible if someone claims they did see Bigfoot, that Bigfoot exists, than if nobody claims. Like if the park ranger is like, no, I've never seen anything like that. That's ridiculous. There's nothing in there. But if they said, no, I did see it, it slightly elevates the evidence. Not enough to make me think it's even remotely plausible, but a little bit. Now, the problem is, when I see people arguing in philosophical contexts and they appeal to phenomenal conservatism, they often seem to be treating this as some sort of burden shifting move. Now, imagine I said, hey, I went camping and I encountered Bigfoot. Would you take it seriously if I said the burden of proof is on you to show that I didn't see Bigfoot? Now, I don't like this burden, as if I don't think there's a fact to the matter about who has the burden of proof that's determined by some sort of independent set of principles, as though there's like a code written in the sky and the universe says, thou hast the burden of proof. I don't think it works that way. So I think burden of proof is something that's socially mediated and people take it on as they see fit. So if someone says you must shoulder the burden, you don't have to do it. You could just say, no, I could just leave. So a lot of times philosophers will speak as though there are these binding epistemic and dialectical and rational norms that have you on puppet strings the moment they utter the words like they're magic. And that's not how things are. If someone says you have the burden of proof, you could just say, no, I don't. I don't have to do anything. Now they could say, well, you're violating the principles of rationality. That's not a principle of rationality. That's not a rule. And if someone wants to insist there is, they could make an argument for it. Hey, the burden of proof is on them to make the argument for it. They're making the positive claim, right? And you could just not find their arguments compelling. I don't know what I'm sure people would have arguments like this, but chances are I wouldn't share some of the underlying presuppositions and principles or whatever kind of norms they have in mind. In any case, I don't think typically if someone said, yeah, I saw Bigfoot in the woods, and look, let's say you're disposed to believe in Bigfoot. Okay, fine. I could just make up something. I could say, I don't know, a flying, sparkling unicorn that can I don't know, spit out square circles. Something just that seems maybe logically impossible or just all kinds of absurd and implausible and doesn't figure in any mythologies where it could possibly be more likely to exist than something that I just completely made up. I guess unicorns exist in stories, but let's just say I made up something even stranger. And then I said, look, I have, because of phenomenal conservatism, it seems to me that this thing exists. The onus is on you to show that it doesn't. The onus might be on you to override my justification if that was the goal of the discussion. But if two people are having a discussion, I would have thought the goal is to figure out what's true. And if I have evidence you don't have access to, you're under no obligation to assign as great of an epistemic weight. So you can assign some epistemic weight to the possibility that Bigfoot exists, given my testimony, but you don't have access to quite the same degree of evidence that I do, right? So, we are in different epistemic standpoints. But what I see people doing in practice with phenomenal conservatism is they treat it as though their seemings aren't just theirs. They are like the correct seemings, or they just don't specify. So here's the sort of thing you might see someone say. Someone might say, well, it seems that moral realism is true, and so we are justified in believing moral realism is true in the absence of defeaters. It seems to who? Things don't just seem a certain way. Things seem ways to people. Something can't just seem a certain way. So when people say it seems that moral realism is true, are they saying it seems to me that moral realism is true? Because now there's a big difference between someone saying, hey, it seems to me that Bigfoot exists because I saw Bigfoot in the woods. Didn't you see Bigfoot in the woods? And everyone else is like, no, we didn't see Bigfoot. Okay, well, now I might be justified, but you're under no obligation to also assume by default that Bigfoot exists unless someone presents a defeater. And it's the same thing here. If it seems to you that moral realism is true, or it seems to you that some proposition that would entail moral realism is true, that doesn't obligate anybody else. No one else has to have that seeming. It could not seem to be that way to them. So, but what you'll see is this subtle shift between it seems to me that moral realism is true and it seems that moral realism is true. And often if pressed, what you will see people say, people that, for instance, in the case of moral realism will say is, well, they'll say a few things. They might say, well, it seems that way to most people. It seems that way to professional philosophers. It seems that way, at least to people that have reflected on the issue properly in accordance with the correct epistemic principles in the absence of biases or a commitment to, highly biased philosophical views that undermine their ability to possess or recognize these seemings. They might be able to specify some set of conditions about the conditions under which people have the seemings or they might specify who has the seemings, or possibly both. But they're often not explicit about those seemings. And when pressed, what you will find is that a lot of people, for instance, in the case I always talk about, moral realism, people will say things like, most people have these seemings, or it seems this way to the ordinary person, or it seems this way to most non-philosophers, or all people all throughout history have typically seen morality this way. Those are empirical claims, and those are not accessible to your seemings. You could say, it seems to me that most people are realists, and okay, but that doesn't seem that way to me either. And so at the very least, if you're going to insist that seemings are broad enough to include these sort of downstream inferences based on your prior knowledge, I'm under no obligation to share your inferences about what the world is like empirically, merely because it seems that way to you, that it must seem that way to me. And so if it's, it doesn't seem to me that most people are realists, I don't find that especially plausible. And so what you'll see is that people will shift between it seems to me and it seems, without being clear on what they mean by it seems that something is true. And if they want to cash out that it seems claim in a robust and substantive way, there is a very good chance that they're going to end up having to make empirical claims. And one can then challenge the empirical claims. So, they might, if they want to try to encompass the empirical claims within their seemings, they can try to do that, but they're starting to stretch the notion of seemings in a way that I'm not sure it was initially intended to encompass. But even supposing they could, once again, let's say someone says, it seems to me realism is true. Okay, well, it doesn't seem that way to me. Well, I think it seems that way it seems to me that most people find moral realism to be true. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to me to be the case. Unfortunately, philosophers have, at least in contemporary analytic philosophy, at least in normative ethics, meta-ethics, a lot of the areas I'm more familiar with, epistemology and a few others, and people talk about Gettier cases and these sorts of things, people will make claims about what most people think without having done adequate empirical work. And for instance, in the case of moral realism, this is often done through a sort of semantic analysis of English moral sentences. So you take sentences like murder is wrong, you take them out of their context. They're not embedded in a paragraph. They're not embedded in any actual conversation or exchange that's been recorded and transcribed among non-philosophers. They give you these sentences, and then they analyze what they take to be the meaning of those sentences outside any real context. And then that's supposed to furnish you with facts about the meaning, the semantic commitments that figure into those claims. And then what? You generalize to everyone everywhere? Everyone everywhere speaks the way that you think that people use these specific sentences, what those people think when they use them? Or maybe it's not even about what people think. There appear to be these accounts of semantics that claim not to be offering something that is making a claim about the psychological states of the speakers. And that strikes me as, if anything, even more obscure. But what you get are these strange sorts of cases. And look, maybe someone can make a case for their particular account of language and meaning. Maybe they can make a case that most people are moral realists. But typically those cases aren't made, or they aren't made explicit at the level of the exchange that people are having. So, if two people are arguing, one person says they're trying to make this argument for moral realism, and they are assuming as a background claim most people are moral realists, or most people speak and think like moral realists. That's fine. You don't always have to justify every presupposition and background belief that you have every time you have an exchange. But a person could ask, hey, hold up. It looks like your argument is operating under the presumption that people speak and think like moral realists. Is that true? And if someone says this is a settled matter, maybe they don't think that they have any burden or requirement to take that seriously. The thing is, though, is that particular matter settled? I don't think that it is. So, and I think that there's a case to be made there. So it's never the case that someone could just say, well, I think it is settled, and I'm not interested in having that discussion. I'm not going to turn around and say people, no, now you have the burden of proof to show that people are more realists. If someone doesn't want to shoulder that burden, okay, they don't have to. But I don't feel obliged to share people's presuppositions, especially within an insular field like contemporary analytic metaethics, just because the people in that field have agreed to those presuppositions. I don't feel any more pressure to agree that most people think and speak like realists in the absence of, as far as I could tell, anything amounting to any empirical evidence that is particularly good that would suggest that this is true. In fact, I think an appraisal of that empirical evidence would suggest it doesn't appear to be true. Although I don't know if I don't think that the measures are sufficiently robust or that there's been enough research one way or another to really settle the matter. So for me, I consider the matter unsettled, and I strongly lean towards it not being the case that most people are realists. So I don't think the matter is settled. So if someone insists that these are the presuppositions they're working with, I don't feel obliged to share them any more than if I were part of a group. If I wanted to engage with a group of people doing philosophy of religion, and they just presuppose from the outset certain sorts of things that would entail or very strongly favor theism, I'm not obliged to share those presuppositions. And yet, for whatever reason, a lot of people working in contemporary analytic philosophy, at least in some of the areas that I'm familiar with, do take on board certain sorts of assumptions. A lot of times these assumptions seem to teeter between either being very obscure and strange claims that it's unclear whether they're empirical or not. And often one of the things that troubles me is that it is unclear whether they're empirical or not. And when I've asked or discussed the matter with people, sometimes it seems like people think it's empirical. Sometimes they think it's not. Sometimes they think there's a mix. It's already a problem that it's not particularly clear nor obvious, nor does it appear to be settled, nor despite searching, have I seen any decisive answer on the matter. I have encountered, at least in the psychology metaethics, some commentary from Sid Armstrong where Sid Armstrong seems to take the matter not to be an empirical one, at least with respect to certain descriptive metaethical projects, that this is a kind of back and forth with a few people involved in the discussion. I think Don Loeb, Michael Gill, and a few others in this volume. I think I quoted some sections of this in one of my streams. I'll have to talk about the whole series of discussions at some point because it's really interesting. And it was one of the sort of a formative set of essays that influenced my thinking about these sorts of matters. But in any case, in that particular essay, that the claim is that, yeah, these are not empirical claims, the kinds of accounts that are being offered for these sort of external, descriptively adequate accounts of the outputs of moral discourse. But that's a matter I couldn't even begin to get into now. But yeah, so that should give us some foundation for where I'm coming from with these issues. Now, the issue that I have is that in practice, it looks like people are, just to sort of sum up what I'm getting at here, is that this principle of phenomenal conservatism seems like a modest, reasonable principle. Now, some people might reject it anyway, and that's, again, a separate argument. I think, a lot of the people that tend to be more on my side of things when it comes to criticizing a lot of the way contemporary analytic philosophy operates, they'll tend to just reject phenomenal conservatism. But that's not really the approach I take. I'm not, maybe if on reflection, I really sit down, I would come to reject it. I might even endorse it. I don't know. But that's not really my concern. My concern isn't with that principle. My concern is how I see people deploying what they claim to be the principle, which look to me to be, I guess you could say, like misdeployments or misuses of the principle. And I've talked about this before, where, I mean, for one thing, they'll often present some fact that they claim to be justified on the basis of phenomenal conservatism in a way where they vacillate between whether they're reporting how something seems to them and how they are some sort of, what strikes me as an empirical or psychological claim about how it seems to other people. Often, by the way, this does include their interlocutors, even if their interlocutors resist. So I've had encounters where someone will say, it seems to me realism is true. And, or they'll say, sorry, they don't even say it to me. They'll say, it seems that realism is true. And so we're justified in believing realism is true in the absence of defeaters. And then if I have responded by saying, well, it doesn't seem that way to me, I've been met with incredulity and people just going, how could it not? They're bewildered that I don't share their seemings. And there's sometimes this presumption that I'm pretending. It must seem that way to you. You must have the seeming. I don't. And it can be pretty frustrating when people try to insist that you share their phenomenology. That's not phenomenal conservatism, because I could make the same move. And if I try that just as a sort of, look, I don't think you have your phenomenology, then you have my phenomenology. It doesn't seem to you that realism is true. I mean, one, that's obviously ridiculous. But two, typically, if there's a sort of resistance on whether or not there's a shared phenomenology, what I've seen people do is they then pivot to saying, this is what all the philosophers, this is the phenomenology most philosophers have, or this is the phenomenology that most people have. Back to the empirical claims. So I don't think there's a difference between phenomenal conservatism, which is I am justified in believing that things are the way they seem defeasibly. Fine. That is not the same thing as I am justified in believing things if most professional philosophers believe them, or if it seems that way to most professional. That's a different claim. And that would rely presumably on different epistemic considerations. And one shouldn't vacillate between the two or treat the two as if they're the same, or try to use one to bolster these are separate epistemic principles, and people shouldn't conflate the two. And yet in practice, they often seem to do so. The other thing is, and I'll briefly mention this before I'll get into, well, I'm going to address people in the chat because I see some stuff going on in the chat. And then I'll talk about the blog post that I wrote that is related to the sort of revisiting of phenomenal conservatism. But the earlier concern I raised, in case for some of you this is new content, or you didn't see what I wrote about the epistemic blank check idea. The actual bigger problem that I see is this. What someone will do is you'll get an exchange like this. Okay, well, it seems to me that, let's take some proposition. It seems to me that moral realism is true. In the absence of defeaters, I'm justified in believing moral realism is true. And so I'm justified in believing it. I don't care about convincing you. I don't care about making a publicly valuable argument. I'm justified in being a moral realist. If it doesn't seem the way, that way to you, too bad. If you think you have defeaters that could override how it seems to me, I'll listen. I'll take a look at them. And so you can imagine an exchange where someone goes, okay, well, here's some objections to moral realism. And then, the person that is claiming phenomenal conservatism and it seems to them that realism is true could say, look, I grant that those are some solid arguments against realism. Now, I'm not saying anybody would actually do this. People would in practice, just to head off these sorts of concerns. Typically, the realists will have positive arguments in favor of realism above and beyond how it seems to them. So you could see that as like adding extra evidential points in favor of realism. And they're not necessarily going to concede that the anti-realist has these super knockdown, super powerful arguments. They might think that the epistemic weight of those is pretty low. And so if we're keeping a tally of the points for and against realism, the realists might think they have quite a lot of points on their side, and there might not be very many points on the anti-realist side at all. Or they could think there's a lot of points on both sides and realism barely edges anti-realism out. It's not really the point here. The point is, you could see it as, here's how the tally goes. Let's say the realist just says, seems to me that realism is true. Well, how many points is that? Let's put a question mark on that and say it's something more than 0. So let's say it's at least 1. It's 1 or more. So the anti-realist comes along and presents some defeaters. Now, even if they're not especially strong arguments, the realist might acknowledge that they provide at least some evidence against realism. And so let's say it's 10 points. The realist can then respond by saying, look, you presented a little bit of evidence against realism, but it's certainly not enough to override how strongly it seems to me that realism is true. It's at least 100 points realism is true. So just 10 points is not good enough. So the anti-realist can go, all right, fair enough. Let me go get stronger defeaters. And they get to work and they do a bunch of philosophy and it takes them years and they write their dissertation. And 10 years later, they come back and they're like, I got 1,000 points against realism. Here's 5 new arguments. And look, okay, sure, you made a good point. Argument 3 is not very good. But the other arguments, they're not so bad. And the realist might go, I agree. These are actually pretty good arguments. I do agree. It's 1,000 points against realism. Unfortunately, I don't think you appreciate how strongly it seems to me that realism is true. No arguments against realism are as strong as how strongly it seems to be true. You need at least 1,000,000 points to override how strong it seems to me that realism is true. And so the anti-realist could go back to the drawing board. And this process can repeat forever. And so what you see is that if, it's not enough to just say it seems to you that something is true in the absence of defeaters. There doesn't seem to be any way of quantifying or specifying how strongly it seems to you that something is true. And someone could not, they don't have to be, people could be operating with a degree of epistemic virtue and really be doing their best to reason through these things. But even if they're doing that, they could report an intuition that is so strong that no amount of evidence to the contrary could override it. And so in practice, and this is part of the thumbnail where I put like what your prior is, you could think that the prior probability of your seeming being true is so high that it's asymptotically approaches one. And if that were the case, then someone like every other human on the planet, in fact, you could have the entire universe all, collaborate on providing every possible argument, scraping the universe dry for evidence against how something seems to you, spend a billion, years gathering this. They build Dyson spheres. They have giant computers that span between galaxies, and they get all this evidence together and they throw it at your feet. And if it seems strongly enough to you, if your prior is high enough, you could say, I grant the full force of that evidence, and it's still not strong enough. My prior shifted from 0.99999, a bunch to like 0.99998. Right. So, and you would be operating within in a virtuous Bayesian way. If your prior is strong enough, nothing can change your mind. Now, even if you say, hey, my prior isn't one, I technically could be persuaded. It could be that no possible amount of evidence anybody could plausibly present to you could persuade you otherwise. And so part of my concern with the way that phenomenal conservatism operates in practice is that it gives a nod to and gives the sort of superficial appearance of corrigibility, of fallibilism. You could be wrong. You could change your mind. You are open to the evidence, but in practice, you're de facto incorrigible. Nothing is going to change your mind. And it does concern me that philosophers who, buy into phenomenal conservatism, buy into it in this form. They buy into it in a form where they give themselves license to write epistemic blank checks. They can just assign any arbitrary amount of weight to whatever the content of their phenomenology is, in a way that, by the way, nobody else can access. Nobody can come in and say, hey, you're wrong about your phenomenology. How would you do that? What if it does seem to me that realism is true, to such an extraordinary degree that every argument in the universe just isn't anywhere near enough to override my belief? I'm never going to change that belief. And apparently, am I justified in that? Because if that's the case, then it's, it seems to render, and this isn't phenomenal conservatism, but if one is justified in believing, if one is justified in believing anything, so long as they are disposed to be psychologically incorrigible, so they're justified. That seems to make justification something that is rather cheap and not very important, because you could imagine in principle, and maybe some people that disagree with me about how agency and psychology and various other sorts of considerations work would just disagree that this is possible. But to me, I would think that it is possible for you to, in principle, design an intelligence, like whether you did some sort of synthetic biology or artificial intelligence or something like that, that in principle simply has, you could say, semi or quasi incorrigible beliefs. You could just, in other words, you could assign any arbitrarily high prior below one to it. It could just be 0.999, 59s to whatever belief. So you could assign it a very high prior that all bananas are the number 3. You could assign it a prior that all potatoes are sentient beings that, are of thousands of times more morally important than any other beings in the universe. You could assign it any arbitrary prior that something is true, and it could have a whole really accurate model of the world and say, look, I understand that my belief that bananas are the number 3 is wildly incompatible with all of my other philosophical views. But look, I'm just going to have this one little, it's my own sort of, the epicycles and it's like, it's my own little strange thing that's a little different. But you could have a whole bunch of beliefs and you have this really solid model, and there's like one thing that sticks out that doesn't seem to square with the rest of your theory. But you could say, look, I don't know how to render it consistent, but the most, like, my inference to the best explanation for what the world is like is that the world has all these consistent laws and principles and all this stuff is the way it is. And that for whatever strange reason, bananas just are the number 3. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it seems true to me. And whenever I reflect on it, it seems plausible. I understand you could point to all these other principles. I understand that it might seem like it's inconsistent with my views about the metaphysics of numbers and bananas, but it just seems true. And my prior is just so strong. I'm sorry, it just seems true. I think in principle, you could design a being to think that way. And would it be justified? Right? Yeah, maybe. Let's say no. Okay, well, then there are limits to how much money you could write onto your epistemic blank check. Your bank account isn't infinite, right? So that would be one conclusion. The other conclusion is you are justified. Okay, well then I don't care that much about justification because anything can be justified. But another insight about this is that it does seem to me to render some of these questions as psychological questions about a particular agent's degree of incorrigibility or lack of incorrigibility. And I'm not sure how much stock I should put in that. Why should, for me, what I'm ultimately going to ask is for someone that says, look, this seems true, and I know you have a bunch of evidence to the contrary, but it just seems so true to me, is why does it seem so true to you? What if you found out that it seems so true to you because an evil scientist that wanted to prove my points, a million years ago, designed the world so that you would eventually think that, and they just programmed you to think that? If I found that out, maybe I would be, if you found out that the reason you were so confident that something was true is because, I don't know, like some movie villain hypnotist had hypnotized you when you were a child and made you forget about it, and they give you some type of drug that changed the way your brain functioned. I would start to doubt my beliefs. Maybe I wouldn't start to doubt them because they changed my brain, so I can't doubt it. But this seems to me to cheapen the notion of justification, because it seems like justification is simply a function of the degree to which one is willing to change their mind. And if that's all justification is, I'm not really sure I care so much about justification. So I think I've said a lot here. I've talked for a while, and I really should get to the chat and start seeing what people are saying. So let me have a look. I probably didn't say hi to people that I should have said hi to a long time ago. So let me get to those. Thanks for checking on the audio for me at the outset. Hey, Jonathan. Hi. I get a hi. I believe you. Thank you. Hi to you as well. And then let me get to, I got another person. Hey, yep, I'm doing fine. Okay. All right. So let me look at some of these earlier comments. Are you still here? Well, okay. Well, I know sometimes you got to get going, but if you see this later, I'll do my best to address it here. I haven't even read it yet. I should probably read stuff before I put it up here in case someone, starts messing with me and posting something goofy. Okay, let's see. I think there's a practical problem here where most people who are aggressively in favor of phenomenal conservatism have adopted phenomenal conservatism only after learning about how it allegedly justifies their more outlandish beliefs. That might be true. There is something I think is really off about the way a lot of philosophy works, where I think a lot of it works in a conclusions first, reasons after sort of way. And I think that really facilitates this more lawyer-esque style of defending claims than one would have hoped for philosophy. There's a great paper on this. I probably mentioned it a few times. It's by Bishop and Trout. And let me see if I can recall the name of the paper. I think it's called The Pathologies of Standard Analytic Epistemology. And they talk about what they call the stasis condition when it comes to trying to build an account of knowledge. And what they quote some philosophers, and they talk a bit about this. And what they talk about is how what philosophers will do is they'll begin with, okay, well, we seem to have knowledge. We know some things. We don't know other things. Now we need an account of what knowledge is that more or less maintains that picture of the world. So you start out with a particular picture of the world. And if an account of knowledge would result in it's too permissive, you know a bunch of things you don't think you know, then in virtue of that fact alone, it must be an incorrect account. If the account is an excessively skeptical account, well, then it must be wrong. So how do you judge whether it's too skeptical, whether it doesn't tell you that? So you could have a big list of things. You start your theory. I want a theory of knowledge. The theory of knowledge, one of the success conditions is, here's a big list of things that I think I know. Here's a big list of things that I think I don't know. A success condition is the correct account can't change that picture a whole lot. It's got to end up saying the basket of things I know, I still know. The basket of things I don't know, I don't know. And so if an account is too skeptical, it's wrong. If an account is too permissive, it's wrong. And they call this the stasis condition. And, part of what they emphasize is how this is not an especially effective approach to trying to build an account of anything, because it can't really move us forward. It just sort of, we're supposed to sort of clean up after ourselves in terms of, well, we're already right. Now let's figure out why we're right. What? That's a weird way to approach things. Now, that is probably, I think I would be surprised actually if a lot of people working in analytic epistemology didn't see that as, and of course, maybe my characterization is not entirely accurate, or it's more polemical than they would have put it. So it could be both not entirely an accurate representation of what they think, and it could be an excessively polemical one. But okay, then let's just talk about my account then, and never mind their paper. Go check out their paper. That's a cool paper. It pairs well with this other cool paper that they have called, I don't remember the name, but they talk about strategic reliabilism, which is their own epistemological account. It's a cool paper too. Anyway, so I think a lot of analytic epistemologists would see that as just a polemical and not a very accurate characterization of how the field works. And there may be some merit to that, but I think there's a grain of truth in there being this kind of hostility towards positions that you could say are revisionary or radically at odds with what people are disposed to think is true at the outset of inquiry. We're really not supposed to change our mind too much. And, when you compare that to the sciences, well, it could turn out that reality isn't the way that we thought that it was. So, and if that is highly inconsistent with our image of what the world is like, too bad. The data's not really going to comport with our hopes or our expectations or our desires for how reality is. And I think that philosophers are more resistant to that. They're not always more resistant to that. It's not like philosophers haven't proposed rather unusual or seemingly counterintuitive or strange solutions to things. You do have views like, I spoke to Goff. Goff proposes panpsychism. So you do have philosophers defending views that might be seen to be out of accord with how ordinary people are disposed to think. And they can support those by saying, hey, they seem to, when you reflect on it, it might not seem to be a plausible view, but when you reflect on it, these views seem to do some sort of philosophical work. They address problems. They thread needles that we're not able to thread readily with more commonsensical or familiar lines of thought. So philosophers, I'm not saying they're always averse to this, and I'm not trying to say that nobody in epistemology is doing, anything productive at all. But there does seem to me to be this excessive focus, and maybe some of that is fading away as people move into, certain sorts of approaches to epistemology that I might be more amenable to. But there at least was throughout the latter half of the 20th century a whole lot of this. Okay, let's move through some more comments. All right. They learn that if they claim intuitions about something, they have this handy tool to deflect challenges to their cherished beliefs. It makes me suspect that some adherence to phenomenal conservatism isn't totally genuine. Yeah, so I don't know if, I don't know. I mean, it may or may not be. Okay, so we have this question. Do you have any thoughts on the reliance of English in making these sorts of semantic claims? So I don't know any other languages. So it makes it difficult for me to speak from any direct knowledge of what these sorts of analyses could or would look like in different languages. I have seen some empirical research. What I can say is some efforts to try to translate measures in experimental philosophy into other languages often are confronted with difficulties. It's already difficult enough to translate scales into different languages and then assess them. But when you're trying to ask about certain sorts of concepts that are, philosophical concepts are often hard to frame or convey because they often rely on terms of art or jargon that might be specific to the field. And it might be difficult to convey that to people in everyday discourse. So I don't know how that really works in other languages. So I can't really speak to the language question. I'm also not a cross-cultural psychologist, but I am highly aware of and have frequently talked about research on, what are called weird populations. So Heinrich Hein and Norman Zine have this paper. It's at this point, it's been very heavily cited. A lot of people have heard of this. Most of you have possibly, I would think a lot of you have heard of it. Maybe most of the people listening. It's called, so weird is this acronym that means Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, what they talk about in that paper, and you really should check out that paper. I think it's one of the most important papers in psychology, and I think it really is important for a lot of fields of the social sciences more generally. They point out that the vast majority, and by vast, I really do mean, it's not like 51%, but almost all research in psychology has been conducted among people from specific nations and populations. A lot of it is conducted specifically in the United States. And when it's conducted, in the United States or even elsewhere, it's frequently conducted on college students. Now, setting aside the college student issue, and we just focus on where, like what nations the research is conducted in, these tend to be nations that exhibit these characteristics at the population level. So these tend to be countries that are Western countries, the countries that have higher levels of education, industrialization. They tend to be wealthier. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and they tend to be democratic nations. So they have specific types of governments. So that, of course, doesn't mean that all the individuals participating in these studies exhibit any specific characteristics, but it means that at the national level, that one particular population, like people in the United States, if you had psychological evidence that was representative of people in the United States, that evidence is not necessarily going to tell you what people outside of the United States think. If you did a bunch of psychological research on me, it's not going to tell you what my neighbors are like. And, it's the same thing in the case of comparing people from the United States to the rest of the world. Now, you might think, okay, well, this might not be a problem if we go and let's conduct some studies outside the United States. And if people around the world are giving similar sorts of responses, they're responding to surveys in the same way, they're reacting in the same way. If when you present the same stimuli in different cultures in different places around the world, people act and think and speak the same way, then this isn't too big of a concern. Our findings about people in the US generalize to those other populations. And so while, of course, there's lots of differences, at least with respect to the things that we're measuring in psychology, they are similar in those respects. Okay, so people did do this, and it turns out that people around the world are not similar to people from the United States along a lot of measurable dimensions. So they're likely similar along many dimensions. It's not like if you ask people around the world about food preferences that you're not going to get people that tend to like foods that are salty and savory and sweet. You're not going to find, massive differences along many, many, many dimensions. But a lot of the central studies in psychology, how people respond in various sorts of economics games, how people think about moral issues, these sorts of things, people do respond differently around the world. And it's what we found in a lot of these studies is that when you compare people from a bunch of different populations around the world, and you compare people from a population like the United States or Canada or the UK, and you have graphs plotting out the descriptive statistics for those populations, like how much, where do they score in this particular measure, very high or very low, and you look at those graphs, you'll see like a particular score, it'll look, you'll see all these bars that might vary a bit, but they might be similar to one another. And then you see this one bar where if the rest of them are really high, it'll be really low. Or if the rest of them are really low, you'll see this one really high bar, at the far end. And so the way that Henrik and colleagues put it is they say that people from weird populations, when researchers have tested weird populations, that the measures that they get tend to anchor one or the other extreme end of these distributions. So, if there's a bunch of scores, people from the weird populations will have the highest score or the lowest score on some particular measured outcome, whether it be, whatever it might be. Now, is this always the case? No, but a lot of times it is. And so if a lot of times it is and sometimes it isn't, we're not in a position to just presume for any given measure that because we have a measure of how people in the US, or, and especially a lot of times undergraduates taking introduction to psychology courses in the United States, simply because you have a bunch of data on the psychology of undergraduates in intro to psych courses in the United States doesn't mean we could generalize from that data to everybody else in the world. Now, I've often told people this, and people go, well, obviously, of course, not everybody in the world psychologically is going to be exactly like American college students. Sure, but that's who researchers have decided to do most of their research on. And you can imagine why. Because they're at, most of the researchers that are doing this research are in the United States teaching at these universities. And so, a lot of times if you're majoring in psychology, you get course credit when you're taking, in fact, I don't even know if you have to be majoring. You get course credit for participating in studies. And this is a way for people to recruit participants into their studies. Now, people don't just do research on college students. People do use Amazon's Mechanical Turk. People use Prolific. There's these online survey platforms where people can get paid to participate in these sorts of surveys. And there's a few other ways to recruit people. You could also just, stand outside, have a table, and have people come up and survey. You stand outside with a clipboard. There's sometimes you could include your research in national polls. So polling agencies will go out and recruit people. So there's a variety of ways you can recruit people. But the bottom line is that participants in these studies are not psychologically representative of people outside of the study. So, there could be an extra layer here where language, in fact, I'd be surprised if it wasn't the case, where language influences how people respond to these sorts of questions. Unfortunately, I don't study that, so I don't know a whole lot about that. But you're going to have culture, you're going to have language, and you're going to have a whole host of other sorts of factors that influence that cause people to think very differently from one another. And unfortunately, a lot of psychological research just isn't representative of the way most of the people in the world. It's not representative. It doesn't mean they do or they don't think any particular way. It just means we don't know, given the data we have about one group of people, what other people think or how other people would respond to that same data. We're not able to just extrapolate as we see fit to a whole of humanity. And unfortunately, what you see in a lot of psychological research is that researchers will conduct a study on, say, 100 college students in a particular class at a particular point in time. And then you'll see in their general discussion, this is like towards the end of the paper, where they're sort of going over the studies that they ran, and sometimes they'll mention the limitations and concerns that they have and offer a broad theoretical perspective on the research that they just presented. They might say something like, our findings show that people think this way. People, notice they're doing something very, very similar to what philosophers will do when they say people are moral realists, or it seems that way, or it seems to us. Who's us? Who's we? So what you'll see is people will uncarefully generalize to all of humanity. And this is a very common problem. Philosophers do this. They generalize from the way they think to the way everybody thinks. And psychologists do it. They generalize from the way their participants and their samples think to the way everyone thinks. Not even the population the sample is supposed to represent, which already it's going to be a convenient sample, meaning that the researchers selected the participants on the basis of who was easy to recruit, not who would be most representative of the population it's supposed to generalize to. So if you get a bunch of college students to fill out your surveys for course credit, that does not mean that the college students filling out your surveys for course credit are representative of people of the United States. Why would they be? And, that might not be relevant for certain sorts of things, certain sorts of questions, but it might be relevant for other sorts of questions. And you can't always tell without doing the empirical work to find out. So psychologists do this, but philosophers do it a lot of times in a way that's even worse. And if pressed, sometimes philosophers will say, look, I'm not just appealing to my intuitions. I have years and years and years of experience. I am familiar with the language I'm speaking. I know how the words work in the language. I'm not just any person randomly thinking about this. I've spent a long time studying the terms and the concepts. I've had a bunch of training in philosophy. And so I'm really good at thinking this through. I'm really good at thinking about breaking down distinctions and thinking about the meaning of terms. And not only that, I'm part of a community of thinkers who also mutually think about this. We correct one another. Someone can point out an ambiguity in what I said. I can point out a mistake in their thinking. And we work together. It's not just a bunch of isolated individuals thinking in seclusion from one another. We are a community of thinkers that mutually correct one another's mistakes and the pitfalls in the way that we think. And we have access to a whole lot of experience, from the people we interact with. We teach courses on this year after year after year, especially if you're teaching intro courses with a whole bunch of students. Of philosophers that are at least working in an academic institution and are lecturing may encounter hundreds and eventually thousands upon thousands of students over the course of their careers. And they meet people at dinner parties. They talk to people in public. They talk at family get-togethers and with their family. Perhaps all sorts of people. They might interact with people in the street. Anywhere they go, they could interact with people. And so philosophers could say, look, I built up this massive repertoire of experience with how people tend to think about these philosophical issues. It's not just me thinking alone in my basement by myself. I'm engaged in the world. I'm embedded in the culture. And in virtue of that huge repository of experience, I am justified in making claims about how people think about these things. And those claims, even if they're empirical, let's give an example they could give. And then the philosopher could say, look, imagine you're a professional chef. Do you need to conduct psychological surveys or not? It doesn't have to be psychology, but you could call it psychology, whatever. Surveys where you systematically evaluate all the customers in your restaurant day after day after day. And, if you don't have p-values and effect sizes and confidence intervals, and you're not running a bunch of regressions on on your customers to your restaurant, you're not justified in knowing whether people like your food or not? That would be ridiculous. You talk to people, you meet other chefs come to your restaurant, you go to events or whatever, people try your food and they're like, I really think you're not seasoning your food adequately. You should try this, or this, you're not preparing your pasta correctly, whatever it is they're saying. You get feedback from your customers. If you're working in a restaurant and you keep getting plates coming back into the kitchen where half the food isn't eaten, and you get, the staff working there come in saying, yeah, it's undercooked, it's overcooked, it's underseasoned, it's overseasoned. They hated this. They threw this out. This person's making a face. That food critic left in a state of clear contempt for this place. You look at your reviews online. You're going to get all this evidence. It's not systematically gathered. It's not empirical science. You don't have to be mega super scientistic to be a chef that learns from the people you interact with and the people around you. That's enough experience to know whether you're a good chef. If you get a Michelin star, if you get great reviews online, if you have customers that are like going, you look out into the dining room and you see someone try the food and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Okay. Do you need to go, how amazing on a scale of 1 to 10? Is it a 9? Oh, okay. Let me gather more data. You don't need to, that's ridiculous. You wouldn't need to do that. And so a chef can know whether they're a good chef, and they don't have to do systematic research. And a philosopher can say, look, just like that chef, I have that experience. If anything, I have more experience. It's not like chefs are cooking for hundreds of people over and over and over, week after week for 16 weeks over the course of a semester, where they get to talk to these people and they come to their office and they sit down with them. They're not constantly, maybe some chefs are like this, but they're not constantly like, hey, try this, going around putting bites of food in people's faces, but philosophers are often going around talking to lots of people. I don't know if you can tell, what I'm trying to do is steel man what I take to be the philosopher's perspective on the matter here, why they don't need to conduct these studies and why that's an excessive and overly demanding claim, is the philosopher can say, look, the chef doesn't even need to do any of that stuff, and they still have tons and tons and tons of anecdotal and experiential evidence to let them know whether they're a good chef or not. And just the same, I have tons and tons and tons of this evidence. We shouldn't forget that, anecdotal evidence isn't no evidence. Even if we go all the way back to what I was saying, an hour ago when I started talking about Bigfoot, if someone saw Bigfoot once, that's some evidence for Bigfoot. It's not convincing evidence to anybody else, not very good evidence. But what if you bring people out in the woods and you see Bigfoot again, and they go, yeah, I see Bigfoot too. And then you bring another group of people and they see Bigfoot. And you bring a third group of people and they see Bigfoot. That is a lot. That's pretty good evidence of Bigfoot now, right? If there's now thousands of witnesses and over years and years and years, you take people out and you're like, look, people 10 years ago when I started this, nobody believed Bigfoot was there. Let me show you. Okay. Follow this trail. You go in the woods, you take a group of 30, 40 people. There's Bigfoot. And they see Bigfoot and Bigfoot's like, hey. So people know Bigfoot's real, right? So if you did that enough times, now aren't you justified in thinking Bigfoot's real? If a lot of people, you lead them there and they go, yeah. Well, think about what philosophers do. They present their thought experiments and their intuition pumps and the various cases to people, the trolley problem, that sort of thing. And year after year after year, they get similar feedback. Say, you present the trolley problem to your students, 90% of students reliably are on board with saying, yeah, I think it would be permissible, even obligatory to pull the switch. I don't think it would be permissible or obligatory to push a person to their death, to stop a train from hitting 5 people. And so you build up this repertoire of knowledge and experience where you could say, and it turns out, because now there is empirical research on this, the accurate judgment. Yeah, most people seem to have these judgments where it's okay to pull the switch, but it's not okay to push a person to their death. And so that would seem to indicate that's at least maybe some evidence against the view that ordinary people are intuitively disposed towards utilitarianism. Do you really need to conduct a study to figure that out? So I think that is how a lot of philosophers might view the practice that they're engaged in. Now, you can imagine a few concerned with this. Now there's a whole bunch of them. Some of them are that they're interacting with people that are, they're a lot of philosophers, like most of the people that are responding, for instance, to the Phil paper survey are from weird populations, and most of their students are going to be. And even if their students aren't, there is some research showing that a lot of times when people receive certain kinds of education, they're sort of inducted into a particular weird mode of education. And so they tend to think more like people from weird populations do. And so you're going to get these factors where the very way in which there's going to be these self-selection effects. So the people that are in your classes are more likely to have greater homogenization in the way that they think relative to people that are not participating in your class. So you get these selection effects that are causing the people in your philosophy courses to not be psychologically representative of people outside those courses. You're also simply going to have the fact that people that choose to take philosophy courses are not necessarily going to think like people that don't take philosophy courses. But there's going to be a whole bunch of other issues. There's another study in experimental philosophy showing that when you give people like, hey, test this hypothesis, and people have philosophical views, that they design stimuli in ways that biases participants toward their favorite conclusions. And this plausibly would generalize to psychological research in general. So this is one reason why we need multiple researchers and converging lines of evidence, and we need to triangulate on the truth from multiple people replicating and conducting similar sorts of studies to one another, or even directly attempting to replicate one another's work. Because our biases, whether totally without it being a matter of malfeasance or doing anything wrong, can filter into the way that we frame our questions and the way that we word things. Now, this happens even in psychological research, where teams of collaborators are constructing this stuff, and they're trying to examine it systematically. They present their measures at lab meetings. They have a chance for people to say, I think those questions are framed in a way that biases participants. But that's not how philosophers are doing this. It's not systematic. And it's not even a survey question that someone's filling out on their computer. You have a person in front of you saying, just imagine a person. Okay, so you wouldn't pull the switch. Would you push the person? Now, you can notice that their tone could imply what sort of conclusion you want. And I would bet you that philosophers that, for instance, we'll just run with a realist example. I bet you realist philosophers tend to find in practice, when they talk to their students, that they could find, even if a lot of students initially say, I'm a relativist, I'm not a moral realist, that they could sway more students towards going, okay, well, I guess I'm wrong, and maybe realism is true. Whereas I would suspect a lot of anti-realist instructors have the opposite impression. I don't know. I would love to see what the research looks like, but I would find it really surprising if there was no difference and that they all notice the same pattern. Like and in fact, this is measurable. We could get professors that teach ethics courses that discuss meta-ethics and bring up realism and anti-realism to test all of their students at the start of the semester and the end of the semester. And my expectation would be that the professor's own position would predict any change in like towards the end of the semester, where basically I think that realist instructors would tend to have more students endorsing realism at the end relative to the anti-realist ones, and vice versa. So this is testable. We could look at this, and maybe I'm wrong. It could be that it could turn out that no matter what, exposure to philosophy, at least in the way it's typically taught in, say, U.S. universities, in introductory courses, inclines people towards moving initially from being inclined towards anti-realism to realism, or vice versa. I would suspect that in a lot of these courses, you're going to get high initial rates of anti-realism, and that they might decrease a bit on average. I'm an anti-realist. I don't want that to be true. I suspect that that's likely to be true for a couple reasons. One is, in my own experience, a lot of people tend to initially endorse some type of relativism or anti-realism. And then also, just most philosophers responding to the Phil paper surveys are moral realists. So, this holds true in case you're wondering. The 2009 Phil paper survey found about 56% of philosophers that responded to the survey endorsed realism. In the 2021, it bumped up to 62%. If you look at specifically philosophers that specialize in meta-ethics, I think it goes up to about 65% endorse moral realism. So even if you're talking specialists, it's still a majority. It's about 2/3. But on the other hand, I don't know what proportion of people that are discussing realism and anti-realism as a substantive part of the course are actually specializing in meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is pretty prominent among the people that responded to the survey, I think. So it was 1,785 people responded to the 2020 Phil paper survey. Not everybody answered every question. Sometimes people responded that they were insufficiently familiar with the question and skipped over answering it. So not every question on there has 1,785 responses. You might get 1,500 for one and 1,600 for another. So because some people, they just didn't answer some of the questions. But I think you had something like 220 something meta-ethics people in there. What does that come out to? I think it's a little over 10%. So I'm going to say it's like 13%, I think. We can look it up. Let's look it up. Let's take a second to do that. I bring up the Phil paper survey results so much that I should just have them in front of me. So I'm pulling them up now, and I'm going to see how close I got on these. Let's see. Main survey results, questions, target population. I'm trying to find the results. Oh, right. Okay, so 1,785 responses. Meta ethics was 228, so it was in the 220 range. So let's see what that is. 228, 1,785. It's 12.8%. Great. Okay, so that was pretty close. Okay, so 12.8%. So that's, to me, that's actually pretty surprising. So that would mean more than 1 out of 10 philosophers that responded to the survey specialize in meta ethics. That's a lot, I think. If you look at this, you'll see. Let me put a link in the chat. I really should get to more comments in the chat. I'm way behind on responding to those. All right, so you can see those in the chat. I just posted it. In fact, I will pin that. And you really should look at these results sometime. They're really, really interesting to look at. Okay, and so what do we got just to go through these? So the most common, I should have done a survey on, or like a poll on this to ask people what they thought the most common was. I'd be interested. I don't know what I would have said if you asked me, but I think I would have chose metaphysics, but it's not the most common. So the most common is epistemology at 407, then metaphysics at 373, then normative ethics at 358. I might have picked normative ethics too. I think I would not have picked epistemology. So even with all the hindsight bias, I think my order would have been metaphysics, normative ethics, epistemology. I don't really have a strong reason why. It just feels like ethics is popular. And then I feel like metaphysics is the most philosophy of the philosophy. It's the philosophiest of philosophies. So that's what I think. I think I do have reasoning there. Metaphysics seems like the most philosophical of the major branches. So first of all, I would have thought the top three would be those three. And then metaphysics would be the top, then normative ethics, then epistemology. That's reversed. No, it's okay. So it's epistemology at 407, then metaphysics at 373, then normative ethics at 358. So they're actually pretty close to one another. What does surprise me, if you continue through the list, philosophy of mind at 355, that's a lot of people. I guess like consciousness, and there's so much to do in philosophy of mind. It's not that surprising. Then you get social and political at 287. So that's one of the first big drops from, I guess you could say, the big four. Then you have philosophy of language at 281, so just behind it. Then metaethics at 228. I would consider that the second big drop. And then right below that at 226, they're almost tied, is applied ethics. And then after that at 200, general philosophy of science. See, why wouldn't general philosophy of science be bigger than philosophy of mind? I don't know. Someone that knows more about history of philosophy in the field would know why maybe that's plausible, because it's not. I mean, it's almost double at 355 versus 200. Then you get 17th and 18th century philosophy. I would have thought 19th century philosophy is more popular. See, again, though, not 19th, 20th century philosophy. When I think of 20th century, like when I think of name people in philosophy, sure, I could mention Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and I could Hume and Kant. Okay, fine. Okay, people are big fans of Kant and Descartes, and there's a lot of the big names are going to come from that particular period. But I guess for me, it's a bias. I tend to care more. Basically, if it's before the 20th century, I'm much less inclined to have a favorable view or be interested in that work. That's not to say that there aren't philosophers that I like before the 20th century, but it's a lot less common for me. I tend to be more interested in stuff that's a lot more recent. And so that's my own bias. Of course, people are interested in a lot of stuff that is of less interest to me. Then you have philosophy of cognitive science. Logic and philosophy of logic is only at 152. See, that's lower than I think I would have expected. Philosophy of religion at just 141. And I'm not going to go through I just want to see what's just look at the rest of it. There's not a lot of them just are, okay. Well, I mean, there's more, but I'm not going to read a whole list. But yeah, metaethics at 228. And then it's interesting. You do have continental philosophy on there at 95. So the survey wasn't only analytic philosophy, but it is heavily favorable towards it. And then you can look at the other demographics there. Okay, let me get to some comments. I think I'm going to need to take a quick break after that, and then I will come back. Let me have a look through here. Did I miss your explanation of defeaters? Yeah, I didn't really give one. So let's see. So you're going to have defeaters that are basically going to undermine the particular view, or they're going to favor some other view. I forget the what is it? Undercutting. What is the terminology? I just don't remember the terminology off the top of my head. I don't tend to like defeater language. Defeater, why? It's, to me, a lot of the language seems overwrought and too much. Like it's too specific to philosophy, and a lot of times I think that non-technical language conveys these ideas easier. But I should still know the terminology, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. Let me look it up just so I could provide that for you. And if somebody knows it, you could post it in the. Yeah, so this is the distinction I had in mind: rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters. So an undercutting defeater is going to be a reason for not believing. I'll just read it off of IEP. So rebutting defeater for some belief that P is a reason in the broad sense for holding the negative negation of P, or for holding some proposition Q incompatible with P. And then an undercutting defeater for some belief that P is a reason in the broad sense for no longer believing P, not believing the negation of P. So you're going to either have some sort of argument against the original view or in favor of some contrary view, roughly, I guess. That's about it. So, basically you believe one thing, and there could be information, someone could present arguments, evidence that could either cause you to not believe that proposition or cause you to believe some other proposition that would run contrary to that particular one. Maybe I'm not characterizing that accurately. I'm not a big fan of the defeater talk. I don't think it's all that useful or precise. I see on here they have some other type of, I haven't heard of this term before, no reason defeater. Okay. Yeah, so I haven't covered defeaters in any depth. I don't really think it's too critical for addressing this particular question. Yeah, that would be useful. It's not my terminology. A lot of times I'm pretty antagonistic towards the way a lot of the ways philosophers frame things. That's no excuse for not knowing the specific framings, especially if I'm going to make a point of talking about them. You see, so this is the kind of thing where I'm going to start getting concerned. So do you think metaphysical modality is gibberish? I don't know. A lot of that kind of talk concerns me, and maybe some of the ways people talk about it are gibberish. But I'm not sure. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a question that's more amenable to me addressing it. So do I think free will is unintelligible? No. So if someone is going to say people have free will, or free will means something, they could characterize what they mean. And, I think some of the libertarian accounts I can't really make sense of, and those might be unintelligible, but compatibilist accounts make sense to me. I don't endorse compatibilism. But, if I see someone articulate various compatibilist accounts, they don't seem unintelligible to me. I tend to be a quietist about free will too, but that doesn't mean that I don't see the point that proponents of compatibilism are making. It's one of those cases where I think if you're sufficiently clear on what you're saying, it'll either end up being true or it won't, depending on what you're saying. And so you're going to get a similar sort of situation to what I say about moral realism, where it's going to be trivial, false, or unintelligible. A lot of the compatibilist accounts just, they might bring in presuppositions that would render the account not trivial that I wouldn't share. So if they start bringing in presumptions about moral responsibility or normative considerations, then I would locate my concerns with that whole philosophical outlook somewhere outside of their characterization of the relevant kinds of agency. Sometimes, though, that's a little hard to address because they're sort of intertwined into their conception of agency in ways that it's hard to disentangle. So it's the kind of thing where what I would say about free will is that I handle it on a case-by-case basis. Some accounts, I think that the proponents of the account are not going to be able to articulate the account in a way I can make sense of. Some of the accounts, I'm going to, reject the account as false. And then some of the accounts, I'm going to say, okay, that what you're saying isn't false, but it just seems like a sort of verbal redescription of something I already believe and can characterize without having to use that language. And it doesn't make any practical demands on me. So what I don't think you're going to get is a true, intelligible, non-trivial account of free will that is going to be able to import or bake in the sorts of clout or practical oomph that I think, for instance, a lot of non-naturalist realists are going to want. All right. We have one person that stands by the potato thing. Fair enough. Okay, so this was 45 minutes ago. Yeah, do you answer questions during the stream? Yes, eventually. Often what happens is I just start talking. And, for me, a lot of this is very extemporaneous. So a bunch of things could go wrong. Here's some things that could go wrong. A lot of times I don't have a great memory. And a lot of stuff that I could cash out readily in written work is pretty hard to do extemporaneously because I'm just talking. And then it's like, what's that term? What's that word? And I can't remember things where, like if I sat down and I'm like, what are the different terminology people use for defeaters? Oh, right. Okay. So there's rebutting and undercutting. I don't use that language in my own writing. I don't prefer to write and think that way. And I don't really immerse myself so much in what a lot of, if you're not familiar with where I'm at. So in my background, I studied philosophy like back about 10 years ago, did grad school for that for a couple of years. And then I moved into psychology, and I have been working on that for quite a long time, studying social psychology. And what I do is I study the psychology of how people think about traditionally philosophical questions. And a lot of my interest is in the methods used to basically sort of translate philosophical questions into something that is amenable to empirical inquiry. And I've spent so many years steeped in that among other things, I'm kind of in both worlds simultaneously. And I really haven't got to dig into a lot of the academic work in metaethics that I would like to. So while I'm talking about it a whole lot, I think a lot of times, and this is something that I don't want to, I think a lot of people hear me talking about metaethics. Some people are going to have the impression that I've read everything that there is to read and I know everything there is to know. Some of the people are very much not going to think that. They're going to think, Lance has this strange outsider view that is really implausible and is not very defensible. And so you're going to get a very polarized view on this. Now, it doesn't mean I haven't read quite a bit, but I haven't read as much as a lot of people that specialize in metaethics. A lot of people have dug a lot more deeply into a lot of the stuff, and they're more knowledgeable about quite a bit of it. And I would not begin to suggest otherwise. So, that is always a particular type of limitation if you are interdisciplinary and you don't make the time to be as much of a specialist in one area as the people in that area themselves are. So there's going to be people that have read a lot more and know a lot more about, for instance, broader philosophical considerations that weigh in on how they think about these issues. I think there's probably a lot of professional philosophers that know a lot more about logic than I do. In fact, I'm certain of that. So that's going to give them a sort of a toolkit that I'm not going to have anywhere near as much access to. They're going to be more knowledgeable of the history of philosophy, and they're often going to be more knowledgeable, especially of the older literature on metaethics, but some of the newer literature as well. And, that can put me at a dialectical disadvantage. People are going to know things I don't know. And, I could get quite a lot of things wrong. And I don't want to give the impression that I think I know everything there is to know about metaethics. I think I know quite a bit about the empirical research on the psychology of metaethics. I do know about that, but I know a lot less than a lot of people in the field. And so when I hold these views that are highly contrary to a lot of, you could say, mainstream views in metaethics, and people, are wondering, what puts you in a position to have these sorts of views. One is that I've read enough where I'm pretty sure I have a decent handle on these things. So if I give an account of relativism or more realism or more, non-cognitivism or something like that, I think that the characterizations that I give are pretty standard. I don't think that they're too outlandish or unusual or anything like that. But it's entirely possible that, like, for instance, here would be one thing I don't know a whole lot about. I don't know a whole lot about the various different substantive content of different naturalist realist accounts. Just haven't read through too many of those. So there's going to be rather large gaps in my knowledge and understanding of this stuff. And even saying this, that could give people that very much disagree with my views, because I defend pretty unconventional views of metaethics, a tool when arguing against me. But whatever. I have no interest in playing, being secretive about what I claim that I know or I don't know when addressing these topics. I'm not going to give that impression. I don't want people to have the impression that I think I know everything about these sorts of topics, nor do I like when other people try to give that impression or are not really explicit up front about their limitations in their knowledge. Anyway, that goes way beyond what you're addressing here. But yeah, I do my best to answer questions in the stream at some point. Oh, well, tagging will sometimes work, but I'm not always watching the stream. I saw this. He does just tag him. All right. So let's try to get through some more of these. The phrase sensus divinitatis, deity, was popularized by a French person. I don't know the context of you saying that. It must have been in response to something I was saying earlier. But sometimes I use the term sensus philosophicus or something like that to describe, or sometimes I've said sensus divinitatis to describe what it looks like I take a lot of philosophers to see themselves as doing. Anyway, to go back on those remarks I was making earlier, in spite of the fact that I will acknowledge that there are limitations in my knowledge of the field, I do think I bring a lot to bear that people within the field don't bring to bear. And I think that there are important metaphilosophical considerations that a lot of philosophers operating within analytic philosophy are not knowledgeable about, or don't appreciate to the degree that I think that they ought to appreciate them. So I don't think that questions in metaethics are the exclusive province of contemporary analytic metaethics. So you'll hear me saying this a lot. So when I say contemporary analytic philosophy or contemporary analytic metaethicist or contemporary metaethics, I am talking about a specific, we're talking people that are publishing and working in the field of analytic philosophy in metaethics in the past few decades. Now, the reason I circumscribe things to that is because that is the sort of current generation, or you could say like the paradigm in which a lot of the discussions I'm having tend to occur. They tend to occur among a fairly small, we're talking, you saw out of those respondents, it was about 13% of the people that responded to the Phil Paper survey specialize in metaethics. That's actually a lot as a proportion of the respondents, but that was 228 people. And so I don't know how that generalizes. I think how many philosophers are there? A few tens of thousands. We're talking a few hundred people. And then if you include the whole world, we're talking a few thousand people in the whole field. And how many of them are currently actively publishing and working? We're talking at most a few hundred, maybe. So this is a very small, very insular group with a rather somewhat obscure what the methods of contemporary analytic philosophy even are. And I'm not the only person saying this. So there are people that are writing within the field. You have Maschery, Capellan. You have a few other people that have criticized, for instance, contemporary framings of philosophical methods that claim that philosophers ubiquitously rely on intuitions. They've argued that they actually don't, and that concepts like terms like intuition actually break down into a bunch of other stuff, and they're not really distinguishable. They're not sui generis. They're not distinctive to philosophy. They're not part of a distinctive method. They're just a word that's used to reference a whole range of inferences and judgments that they're not like a natural kind, and they're not distinctive to philosophy. So there's people that make those sorts of arguments. So the methods of analytic philosophy remain obscure, underdeveloped, poorly articulated, and not widely addressed or discussed that much by philosophers themselves. You don't see a whole lot of philosophers doing metaphilosophy or philosophy of philosophy. And so they're using a methodological toolkit that isn't very well understood even by them. And, they could claim otherwise, but there are not a lot. You don't see, I never saw a course, and I'm sure they exist, but it's not a standard part of one's education to really dig in to the tools of philosophy in the way, if you're doing, a graduate degree in science or even an undergraduate degree, you're going to get exposure to these, as if there's one, the scientific method. Science, like if you study psychology or something like that, you're going to take stats courses, you're going to take research methods courses. it's very methodologically oriented, and my psychological research is really, really, really focused on methodology. In fact, I do what you could call kind of meta research. I do research on how we do this research. So, it's very methodologically oriented, and as far as I can tell, analytic philosophy is not. And so we're dealing with a field that I think is relying on questionable presuppositions about how language and meaning work. They're relying on obscure and questionable methodologies that are often underdeveloped. And so what you have is this purported group of people that have a certain type of expertise. And I readily grant that analytic philosophers are experts at a whole bunch of stuff. Logic, or argumentative analysis. They're good at analyzing, taking complex, difficult, and opaque writing and unpacking it and understanding the claims being made and the arguments being made. They could take a passage where there's an argument implicit throughout a whole bunch of prose and extract the argument from it and formalize it, regiment it, analyze it. So analytic philosophers have a whole bunch of skills and abilities. But what I don't think is that as a group, they have any sort of claim on saying, we as a group are experts at reaching the correct philosophical conclusions. And part of the reason for that is that this is a highly insular and self-selected group that then interact with one another and could cause one another to change their minds and converge on particular conclusions about what's the correct philosophical account for reasons unrelated to the quality of the arguments and merits of those particular positions. And so, although, so basically what I'm saying is I am coming at addressing questions in metaethics without having my mind fully saturated in this specifically analytic philosophical mode of thought. I don't buy into the methodologies that they use. I don't think armchair analysis is exclusively or even they might not say exclusively. I don't think it's primarily or often the right way to address specific sorts of questions. For instance, I think a lot of moral realists just, they appeal to intuitions in a way that I think is uncritical. And I'm careful to say, I'm not saying don't use intuitions, because I think that saying we should or shouldn't use intuitions is too categorical. It's too blunt of a claim. It's too vague. It's too underdeveloped. I think we probably, let's say we need some intuitions. Okay, which intuitions? What do you mean by intuitions? Under what circumstances do we need them? How do we figure out which intuitions are reliable or not? So for instance, when people are reporting an intellectual seeming, what psychological process is that an output of? The bottom line is, when a philosopher is reporting this, they don't know. We don't have introspective access. We're not saying, that's, it's not like our whole neurophysiology for each individual is fully mapped and that you have perfect psychological access to it. So that when you introspect and someone says, okay, well, why are you having the intuition that such and such is the case? You say, my left temporoparietal junction is my ventromedial prefrontal cortex is firing at this particular rate. And that's an indication that this particular network or node of psychological mechanisms is operating, and it's an output of that system. And I know that system is reliable, so I know this intuition is reliable. No, they don't know which system. They don't know. I mean, we don't know how many systems there are. We don't know how they interact with one another. At least when you're producing a judgment, with respect to that judgment, you don't know how many systems are, how they interact with one another, which system it's an output of, what the relative reliability of those different systems are. And so you're trusting the output of an unknown, it's a black box. You don't know what the process is or how it's working. And so philosophers are saying, well, my intellectual seemings are reliable. Well, why are they reliable? Well, intuitions are generally reliable. What do you mean by intuitions? Your intellectual seemings, your senses, like what is inside the box and outside the box? How reliable does it need to be? But you have this general problem where they're inferring that because their intuitions or their judgments or whatever you want to call them are generally reliable, that they're reliable in this particular case. But in this particular case, you don't know if it's an output of it's not like there's one big system generating outputs. And that the system, so you can't just say, okay, well, the base rate of the system is 98% accuracy. So any given output, all those being equal, is 98% accuracy. No, you don't know which system it's an output of. It could be the result of an unreliable process or reliable. We don't know. And so you have this problem where I think philosophers are relying on an epistemic toolkit that I think is only makes sense to assess its utility even if somewhere in the chain of reasoning, at some foundation, we need some initial intuitions as a foundation. I'm not even granting that. I'm just saying, let's just grant that for the sake of argument. Those initial intuitions, I think the subsequent epistemic framework that we would want to adopt for going on to build our accounts and our theories is going to be deeply dependent on understanding the psychological apparatuses that are in operation because basically what I'm saying is this: philosophers are using a particular tool. They're using a particular instrument for pursuing philosophy. That instrument is the mind. The mind I see is the outputs of, or the function of, the brain. And if we want to understand whether or not and to what degree it is reliable or working well in any particular case, we need to have a really, really good model of how the brain is working more generally, so that we know which systems, which mechanisms, which processes are in operation in any given instance, in which at any juncture of rendering an output. So if you have a particular, you're analyzing an argument, you're analyzing a particular premise, and it seems true to you, what system is that an output of? Is it a reliable system or not? What is that based on? What's causing the output? Without understanding the underlying causal mechanisms behind our judgments, I don't really think that we're in a good position to make these sweeping claims about the reliability of any particular intuition. And I don't care if we drop the intuition talk and we just talk about linguistic or semantic or conceptual analysis, and we're delivering judgments in response to we're dealing with the method of cases, or we're dealing with trying to achieve reflective equilibrium by considering various sorts of thought experiments or intuition problems. Whatever the framing is, it's ultimately going to come down to certain sorts of judgments. And in many cases, for many philosophers, these are going to be some type of a priori or armchair judgments that are not based on an effort to regiment the judgments in question in accordance with empirical evidence or something like that. And I'm not even saying that you have to do that. What I am saying is that if you're not doing that and you're making these a priori or these armchair judgments, you're doing that using your brain. And if you're using your brain, you're using some mechanism or function or something the brain is doing. And if we don't have a good understanding of what your brain is doing in any given instance or in general, you're not going to have a good model for knowing whether your outputs in the particular cases you're using it are reliable or not. So compared to something like vision or olfaction or your sense of touch, we have not perfect or completed models of how our sensory systems work, but we have enough information from our sensory systems where we could directly corroborate and test the degree to which they are effective and reliable and functional in any given instance. And it turns out they're pretty darn good. But if you're talking about, for instance, intellectual seemings, how good are those? Looks like they're, for people that are good at math, pretty good at math. If you're talking about other sorts of areas where people are experts, take chess players. Chess players are pretty good at chess. How do we know they're good at chess? Because they win games. Like, there's feedback. We know. And math isn't totally disconnected from the world. Maybe there are certain types of abstract and theoretical math where we're not able to test or corroborate it against the rest of the world. And I don't know what to make about those. But with a lot of math, math is going to figure into a lot of our models of physics. If we weren't doing math, we wouldn't have a level of precision. At least practically, in practical terms. Even if you could redescribe physics in non-mathematical terms, I don't know what that would look like. In practice, we're not going to be landing probes on Mars without doing really good math, really, really, really accurate math. And so we're able to check that against the world. It could be sort of externally corroborated. What about philosophical judgments like that there is a stance-independent moral fact that it's bad to torture babies? How do you check it? And so what I think a lot of philosophers will do is they are starting, and this is one reason I discuss the Phil Papers survey so much, is that it really just comes up over and over and over, at least in online discussions. I don't see people citing in papers. I've never seen this in an analytic philosophy paper. The majority of philosophers responded this way to the 2020 Phil Papers. Maybe we'll see these in a couple of years. It's relatively recent, but we do have the 2009 one, and I still didn't see this. So I don't think this is going to happen. And 73% of philosophers endorse this view, and therefore it's probably true. But you do see this in discussions with people. Now, part of my concern here is that I'm not convinced that, sorry, to backtrack a little. I think a lot of people are starting to take what the consensus is, or at least what a majority of analytic philosophers, like those that responded to the 2020 Phil Paper survey, to be really strong evidence that a particular account is correct. Whereas I think that the problems might be more foundational than that. I think that there might be methodological and metaphilosophical problems with the way that analytic philosophy itself functions. So a lot of my concerns are going to come from outside the field, and they're going to be based on broader, you could say broader, I want to say psychological, but it's not just psychological. They are philosophical, but they're not mainstream analytic philosophical concerns. I'm going to have concerns about language and concepts, and I'm going to draw on a broader scope of empirical considerations that come from fields like cognitive science, linguistics, psychology, or just a broader range of fields. And so I take a extremely interdisciplinary approach that is a lot more metaphilosophical, and I try to take a step back and draw on knowledge from and considerations from other sorts of fields to question the presuppositions and foundations that are behind a lot of what philosophers are doing. And so in a lot of cases, I'm really concerned that people are so focused on what a narrow bandwidth of thinkers that are addressing these questions using a rather narrow set of methods are doing. They take them so seriously and they regard them as the experts on the topic that someone that takes a critical outsider's perspective like me could be dismissed merely on the grounds that we are not as much of a specialist or as much of an expert in that literature or in that scholarship. So one way for me to get around that is to just become so immersed in that scholarship and that literature that objection starts to just not really land. And that's going to be the next step. So I've just finished, my psychological work. And so I'm now starting to dive back in to a lot of the philosophical work and really dig into it. I've been reading more sort of, I guess you could say, mainstream analytic philosophy lately. So reading stuff from Mike Youre and who else was I reading? I started reading some stuff from Mashry. What's the book called? Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. I started on that. And then I'm also digging into stuff that I really discovered actually pretty recently, which is that I started to discover that I seem to have this disposition towards a pragmatist view of philosophy, but I actually haven't studied pragmatism in any great depth. So I'm also working through Pragmatism, the book right now. And so I'm sort of rediscovering and reevaluating where I stand metaphilosophically at the moment and diving back in to analytic metaethics, which isn't to say I hadn't read a bit. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of stuff that I've read, I read a whole bunch of stuff on evolutionary debunking arguments over the past, say 10 years or so. Yeah, it's been a while. So I've read a bunch of those. And I got really into the evolutionary debunking stuff. So Sharon Street has a great paper on this. I think it's called The Darwinian Dilemma, on this big back and forth there. I got really into reading, I read Richard Joyce's work on error theory. I read a bunch of stuff from Joyce. I read some back and forth between Joyce and Stephen Finlay. I read a few papers on normativity and normativity itself. Read a few papers on grounding. Some of that stuff was a little tough to get through. I can't recall exactly what I read. I read a bunch of stuff on companions and guilt arguments. So less books and a lot more published articles. Haven't written a paper on companions and guilt arguments yet, but I read some back and forth between proponents of the companions and guilt argument, responses to it. Read some stuff from Humor. Read some stuff put forward by realists. Read Railton. I can't recall a lot of stuff I've read. So some stuff from naturalists, but mostly non-naturalists. So that's a lot of the stuff that I'm starting to dive back into now, having had a rather long foray into the psychology of metaethics and psychology more generally. So hopefully I can update my knowledge on a lot of this stuff. Okay, let's get through some more comments. I said I was going to take a break, but there's just too many comments and I want to get up to date. And then I'll take a break. Okay, Danny says, hey. All right, so here's a concern. All your criticism seems kind of valid, but when I think about it, there just seems to be another option to justify belief by intuition. It seems like denying PC is self-defeating. Yeah, so keep in mind, I'm not denying PC. For those of you that are joining now, I'm not denying phenomenal conservatism. What I am objecting to is a sort of uncritical application of it as a burden shifting tool. I think that's one objection I would raise, is that some people will say, well, it seems that X, therefore I'm justified in believing X in the absence of defeaters. So if you want to present defeaters, go for it. But the other person, it might not seem that way to them. And so how do you navigate that? So something seems, let's say it seems to me there's a tree and it doesn't seem to you there's a tree. Now what? We can't just appeal. So if I don't have defeaters, okay, fine, you're justified in believing it. And now what? Now what? I would have thought the purpose of philosophical discussions is for us to mutually converge on the truth by presenting publicly valuable arguments and evidence, not just saying, well, it seems that way, done. And that's not to say that philosophers don't do this. They will present those public arguments. But I don't think the phenomenal conservative element of this is doing a whole lot of work. Again, if you put this in the framework of like a tally board where you're tallying up scores and there's points in favor and against a particular sort of view, do you get 1 point in favor of your view? Because then that could get knocked over by the slightest breeze of an argument to the contrary. but it doesn't look like people in practice tend to use it that way. Even Mike Humer, who proposed phenomenal conservatism, has said in his blog at some point that he puts the probability of moral realism being true. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but it was like pretty close to 1. It was like, over 99%. It was very, very strong. And that isn't the phenomenal conservatism principle itself. But there's a big difference between saying, hey, the fact that something seems true to me is a little bit of evidence in favor of it. And as long as there's no evidence against it, that I'm justified in believing where the preponderance of the evidence lies. Okay, even supposing that that's true, there's a big difference between saying, so long as it seems true to me, I'm justified in believing in the absence of defeaters, and saying the prior probability that this is true is arbitrarily high to such a degree that no plausible quantity of arguments or evidence to the contrary could shake my confidence in this view. Those are very different claims. So I think people are shifting between the two without being clear about what they're doing and why. Imagine I come to an argument with moral realists and I say, look, this isn't, just imagine, like, I actually went into the field because, again, most philosophers are moral realists. And I said, my confidence anti-realism is true, it's very close to 1. And I get to believe it unless you could demonstrate otherwise. Like, you need to have a whole ton of defeaters. Like, technically, I pretty much do think something like that, but no one is going to care how justified I think I am. Okay, good for me. Bye. Who cares how justified I am? So if all we're able to do is say, I get to believe what I believe if I really, really strongly believe it, and I don't care if you say other things to the contrary, if we share epistemic principles about how much I need to update in response to the evidence, fair enough, I've updated, but hey, I still believe what I believe. That no one can tell you can't do that, and you might be totally justified in doing that, but why should any of the rest of us care? So what? Is philosophy about telling us what you're justified in believing, or is it trying to figure out what's true? I thought it was the second one. The first one comes easily. Everybody's justified in whatever they're justified in believing, but no one else has to have. If a lot of the evidential weight is due to this private inaccessible evidence, none of the rest of us need to care at all. Who cares? I don't care. And I don't think anybody else really would if they thought about this. I mean, are we really, if a whole bunch of philosophers showed up that it really, 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 really super duper mega ultra seemed to them, something that the rest of us think is preposterous, are we going to go, well, now that 70% of philosophers join the field believe Bigfoot is real, or they think the earth is flat or something, we have to believe that? Because look, most of the experts think it. Right. So to go back to what I was raising, the metaphilosophical concerns I was raising. So you have this tiny, tiny field of a few hundred people. And so whatever they think, that's what the experts think. And so I am under enormous pressure as someone that doesn't agree with the mainstream philosophical views. I don't even agree with the less common views. So I reject all of the realist and all of the anti-realist positions. And I'm one of like 2 or 3 people that endorses the views that I endorse. I endorse metaethical indeterminacy, I endorse a few other views. I would have thought we should cash out the arguments and the evidence and evaluate the quality of the arguments and evidence, and then update from there and see where things go. But a lot of times, like for instance, if I put forward what I call the unintelligibility thesis, where I argue that certain forms of non-naturalist moral realism are unintelligible, specifically ones, among other concepts that appeal to the concept of irreducibly normative facts, I think the concept of an irreducibly normative fact is meaningless. I don't think it's meaningful. Now, if you ask professional people working in metaethics about this, they would say this is not a very plausible proposition. And, they might say something like, nobody in the field thinks this, so this isn't plausible. Now, the question would be, and it could be, that if the methods that they're using are good methods and it's caused all of them to think this isn't plausible as a result of those methods, fair enough. Then we need to examine those methods and see if the methods are good. But what we don't get that. We don't get an examination of the methods. We just get a direct appeal to people in the field don't think this way, not plausible. Now, there's a few concerns with that. That doesn't mean the person saying that wouldn't be able to say, here's why I think the methods work, and here's why I think Lance is wrong, and Lance is using bad methods. But the argument is going to turn on us on background disagreements about the metaphilosophical approaches that we're taking to address these questions. It's not going to turn on arguments that are sort of circumscribed within the methodological framework that the analytic philosopher is insisting on, because I don't accept that framework. So they can't say, well, you have to pick a view within my framework. For instance, Mike Humer in Ethical Intuitionism basically says there are 5 metaethical positions. You could be a non-naturalist realist, a naturalist realist, a non-cognitivist, an error theorist, or a relativist, or I think he says subjectivist. Functionally, that distinction doesn't matter for these purposes. You got these 5 positions, these are the only possible positions, pick one. I reject that. Now, The reason I reject that is pretty straightforward. All of the sort of standard metaethical positions in contemporary metaethics include among their theses a semantic thesis. And the semantic thesis will typically be framed in this way. It'll say moral claims are propositional or they're non-propositional. So non-cognitivists are going to say they're not propositional. All of the other four positions are going to be cognitive positions that say moral claims are propositional. And then there are, realists and error theorists are going to agree on the content of those of what those claims mean. They're going to say that they are propositions and they refer to stance-independent moral facts. And then the difference for the realist and the error theorist is going to come down to a metaphysical claim. They're just going to disagree on whether there are stance-independent moral facts. So they actually agree on the semantics. So they actually share the same semantic thesis, cognitivism and stance-independent, the stance-independent truth of the moral claims. And then you're going to have what are the other? Oh, sorry. There's actually three positions because I was just lumping the naturalist, non-naturalist, realist. So three positions are going to endorse that. So you're going to get these three cognitivist stance independence accounts, which is naturalist realism, non-naturalist realism, and error theory. Then you're going to get a cognitivist but non-stance independent account. Well, actually, technically, it could be stance independent. So the real relativism actually can cross-cut and be actually a form of relativism. But so long as you get a view that indexicalizes the moral claims such that they're well, I guess we could just categorize it as stance-dependent accounts. I think that's actually a more accurate way than Hume's framing. So I already have problems with Hume's framing. So let's just say these are stance-dependent accounts. I think that's a more accurate characterization than saying relativism, because relativism, you're going to have potentially, or at least it's conceptually possible to have realist relativist accounts and anti-realist relativist accounts. What matters is what they relativize the moral claims to. They could, in principle, relativize them to something other than stances, in which case it could be a form of relativism. But so long as, and this is actually true of every type of relativism I've actually heard of anybody endorsing, in practice, they're going to tend to relativize them to stances, but they don't actually have to be relativistic. So you could have relation designating accounts. Richard Joyce talks about this. See, I'm already overcomplicating this. So let me go back over that taxonomy, because I think that I don't know that this would really be very different from Hume's framing. So you're going to have two types of realist accounts, naturalists and non-naturalists. They're going to be cognitivists, and they're going to endorse the claim that moral claims are stance independent. Then you're going to have error theorists. They're going to be anti-realists and cognitivists, and they're going to endorse the claim that there are no stance independent moral facts. All three of those are going to agree on the semantic thesis. Then you're going to have these stance dependent accounts, typically some type of relativism, constructivism, ideal observer theory, could be some types of divine command theory. There's going to be a whole bunch where they're going to say that cognitivism is true. Moral claims are propositional, but they do depend on stances. And then finally, you're going to have the non-cognitive. So those are your positions. Sorry, I'm blazing through this. But the point is, all of these positions have a semantic thesis. They're going to say moral claims are propositional, or their moral claims are non-propositional. Moral claims refer to stance-independent facts, or they refer to stance-dependent facts. Now, notice, okay, moral claims are propositional. When I see this, I think, well, which moral claims? To me, someone saying moral claims are propositions or moral claims are propositional is kind of like someone saying fruits are bananas. What do you mean, fruits are bananas? So which ones? All of them? What do you mean? So the claim is so ambiguous, I don't even know what the hell these semantic theses amount to. Are they? It seems like they're treating it as like an analytic fact that moral claims mean something specific, as though moral claims have a meaning. What the hell are they talking about? Moral claims don't, what do they mean by a moral claim? Like, I don't think moral claims are floating in a platonic void. I don't think there's a conceptual category, a moral claim, such that the moral claim itself has a meaning, and that meaning is shared, and that's what makes them all moral claims. Because someone might think, okay, look, what it means for something to be a moral claim conceptually just is that it's a claim of a particular kind, like a proposition about what's morally right or wrong or good or bad that is true independent of people's goals, standards, or values. So just what it means for something to be a moral claim is that it's a stance-independent propositional claim about what's morally good or bad or right or wrong or whatever. You could throw in permissible, obligatory, required, supererogatory, whatever. There's a bunch of other types of terminology you could use to characterize the different types of, and of course I'm leaving out thick moral language. Someone saying something is courageous or brave, and that's going to include by their own, they're going to readily acknowledge there's going to be descriptive elements. It's going to get really complicated. Anyway, so you throw all of that out, right? So if that's the framework, I don't view language that way. If that's the account of language, I reject that account of language. I don't think that words and sentences and phrases have any sort of intrinsic this like meaning independent of speaker intent. My view of language is that I don't think words mean things. I think that people mean things, and I view language as a behavior or a tool by which people communicate their communicative intent. And so I think the only way to understand language and meaning is to contextualize it. Language only makes sense in a particular context of usage. The sentences and words and phrases and terminology has no intrinsic meaning at all. I don't even think that makes any sense. I literally think it's unintelligible. It's nonsensical. To me, it's like saying, this rock, what is the meaning? What does this rock mean? It's just, that's a bad analogy, but I don't think it's the sort of thing that can bear or have meaning, because I don't think that that's an intelligible and meaningful account of meaning. I think people mean things. So if I say, hey, could you give me a glass of water? I can tell you what I mean. I would like you to give me a glass of water. But I don't think the sentence has a meaning independent of my communicative intent. Instead, I think that the sentence is a behavior for me to convey certain facts about my psychology. In a way, it's almost like I'm trying to induce you to have certain types of psychological states using, flapping my mouth and making vibrations in the air. For me, this is a physical process that is a particular type of learned behavior that people have acquired culturally. I think it's a certain type of cultural technology. I don't subscribe to universal grammar. I tend to subscribe to views that language arose. It's a culturally acquired capacity. And I think it's a particular type of behavior. And I think that words and sentences and phrases and language only acquire meaning in virtue of context. And the meaning that they have, it's not that they have meaning, it's that they are vehicles for conveying the meaning of speakers. And so I don't know what it could possibly mean to say that moral claims are propositions. People could use moral claims to express propositional claims. I can make sense of that. And if you want to say moral claims or propositions is shorthand for describing the communicative intent of speakers, fine. I use it because I'll say, oh, well, what does this word mean? I can tell you what the word means. But I don't really technically, literally think words have meaning. I think people use words to mean things. And then we can talk about how people use the words. So it's meaning as usage. It's not intrinsic to the words. And yet it seems like philosophers are trying to offer these sorts of accounts so all of these accounts have these semantic theses that are either presupposing a conception of language that I reject, or, okay, fine. Let's say that they're like, okay, Lance, we actually agree with your account of language, but we're still endorsing one of these views. Well, now we need to reconceptualize what exactly those semantic theses amount to. So if someone says moral claims are propositional, if that's an empirical claim, then maybe that could be understood in a way I can make sense of. That would be I would think it's possible. It's not just a ridiculous claim. Would be something like people are using moral claims to express propositions. Okay, which people? Under what circumstances? What counts as moral claim and what doesn't? This starts to look to me like an empirical claim about what people intend to communicate when they assert those claims. Now, okay, if you're going to make empirical claims throughout the 20th century, all the philosophers disputing these questions about descriptive metaethics. Now, I read this maybe a week or two ago, some quotes from these people, J.L. Mackie and a lot of these other people. They'll say things like, in fact, I'm going to just pull up a quote just to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So I want you to reflect on what these people say and then consider whether it makes sense to say this is not an empirical claim about human psychology. All right. Let's take this claim from Mackie. This is a quote. It's read out of Synod Armstrong's paper, Mixed Up Metaethics. I'm going to post that in the chat. 1 second. It's messing up the formatting. All right. Here is that quote. And I will pin it. Okay. Well, it's split it up into two different ones, so I guess I won't pin it. But take a look at that, and I'll read it for you. Let me bring it all the way down. Oh, wow. So many comments. All right. So here's what you see here. The ordinary user of moral language means to say something about whatever it is he characterizes morally. For example, a possible action as it is in itself, or would be if it were realized, and not about or even simply expressive of his or anyone else's relation to it. So look at this first part of it. The ordinary user of moral language means to say. So this looks to me like this is expressing a claim about the communicative intent of the speaker. Let me give you another quote from, and keep in mind, Mackey is like the founder of error theory. So this is not an obscure person working in metaethics. This is one of the most prominent figures in the field. Let's see. Okay, here's a quote from Smith. This is from, I think it's a book from the early 90s on metaethics. I can't remember the name of it. Here's a quote from Smith. We seem to think moral questions have correct answers, that the correct answers are made correct by objective moral facts. You're going to tell me that's not an empirical claim about what people think, or are facts about what people think not empirical claims if philosophers are making them? If they don't mean by think a psychological claim that's empirically valuable, what do they mean by think? If they don't, so basically, I'm proposing a dilemma. Either the philosopher, a lot of the philosophers that are being quoted here, and of course, I don't know how systematic, but maybe this is very unrepresentative of what other philosophers say about these sorts of things. I don't think so, though. But again, this is an empirical question. So someone could go do a big analysis of what philosophers say and show that I'm wrong. And I'll readily grant that a lot of them are very explicitly not making psychological claims. But I've seen a lot of these and they look like psychological claims to me. And if that's not a psychological claim, so either this is a psychological claim and I could subject it to empirical scrutiny, or it's not a psychological claim. And then what on earth is meant by think? I don't know. What I can tell you is if you look at what Sin Armstrong says in this paper, it looks like Sin Armstrong takes these not to be empirical claims. So we could have a quote from the paper itself. So instead of quoting a quote from the paper, I'll just quote the paper. So you get this remark. Overall, then, I take moral realism and expressivism to be trying to externally describe the semantics of all standard moral language. At least that is the debate I want to discuss. So Sin Armstrong draws this distinction between external and internal accounts. So I'll just read that. There are two ways to describe moral language: an internal project that seeks to capture the psychological processes or representations that actually occur when people use moral language. This is what I study and what I care about. However, contemporary realists and expressivists are not trying to do that. When Jackson and Petit, I don't know how to say the name, use networks of truism, or when Gibbard cites hyperstates, they surely know that these theoretical constructs do not reflect actual psychological entities or events. Instead, they want their theories to be externally adequate in capturing the outputs of our linguistic systems without necessarily reflecting the internal workings of that system. In this respect, their project is more like Chomskyan grammar, which uses constructs without claiming psychological reality. I don't know what that is. The external output, they want externally adequate in capturing the outputs of the linguistic systems. What is that? What is that? There are facts about what the people saying these things mean. What other facts are there? I don't think there are any other facts. What other facts could there be? There's facts about what the sentences mean, independent of the speakers. What? That to me, it just is extremely bizarre. I don't think there's a thing like that. So if that's what they're doing, I just don't buy into this. So, and look, even if I'm wrong, I'm not like logically obligated to think that language works that way. I don't have to think that. And so I don't have to buy in to any of the Humor standard 5 accounts if all those accounts presuppose that. If all the accounts presuppose that we're trying to go for an externally adequate account of our linguistic outputs that makes no claim on psychological reality, I deny there's anything like that. Even if I'm wrong, I'm not obligated to endorse one of those 5 accounts if they're presupposing that. So this gives us a dilemma. If they're presupposing that, I reject them all. If they're not presupposing that, I still reject them all, because if this is an empirical claim, we could then ask the question, okay, when we're saying that we're trying to capture moral claims, what moral claims are we talking about? It looks to me like when analytic philosophers are addressing this, they're dealing with these hypothetical moral claims. They're not talking about any claims anybody's actually making. And I've had these discussions with people before where they'll be like, well, what do you mean by moral? Like, what kind of moral claim are you talking about? I'm like, okay, well, what are you talking about? Give me an example of a moral claim. They'll be like, murder is wrong. And that to me is not a moral claim. Not really. It sounds weird, right? Why? How could murder is wrong not be a moral claim? Well, it's like a hypothetical or possible moral claim. There's a difference between a moral, like someone giving an example of something a person could say. But if your goal, and I take it that I could give you more quotes from these people where the analytic philosophers doing descriptive metaethics, they're very clear that, in fact, I'll just give another one because, I have people say, oh, that nobody really thinks this. So it's like tedious, but I have to give people quotes because if you don't give people quotes, okay, here's one from Youre. So again, someone very central to analytic philosophy, A.J. Youre. Here's the quote. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. So here we have someone talking about judgments and the function of the judgment. So the judgments aren't psychological. This is not an empirical claim. Okay, so if this, again, if it's an empirical claim, we could ask empirically, is this true? If it's not an empirical claim, I don't know what they're talking about. So you have that. Let's find some other ones. A lot of these are not as illuminating, but you see stuff like Timmons, moral statements and their primary role are not assertions of the descriptive kind, rather they are evaluative assertions. Again, are these empirical claims or not? I still can't tell. I can't tell if these are empirical claims. Now, let's suppose they're not. Okay, then I reject them. Let's suppose they are. Okay, what does the actual empirical evidence say? Well, we need to operationalize what it is we're trying to describe. Now, I don't take murder is wrong to be something that is subject to empirical inquiry because who's saying it? Well, what context is it being said? It's, if I said, hey, I want to study human personality, what kinds of personalities do people have? And you said, some people are, openness to experience. That's a personality trait. Okay, so, well, people could be open. Okay, but which people? Under what circumstances? What does that mean? How is that cashed out behavior? You're not describing an actual person. You're not describing any actual behavior. You're not describing any actual psychological states. To actually do psychology is to actually study actual people doing things and saying things and responding to surveys. You're studying actual people. And so my take on how we should go about assessing, I would replace the semantic thesis with some sort of empirical thesis. I don't even like framing in terms of, if you want to call it semantics, go ahead. But if we want to talk about the sort of the meaning of ordinary moral claims, I take this to be an empirical question about what people are actually intending to communicate in contexts of usage in which we could all mutually agree that people are making moral claims. So like, for instance, if I say, this is a glass of water, I think we could agree that that's not a moral claim. But if I saw someone hit another person and I said, that jerk hit that other person, that's morally wrong, I think we would probably agree that is a reasonable candidate for a moral claim. Now, the point is that actual moral claims are associated with someone actually using language in a real context. And that's where I think that that the terminology, to the extent that we could say, even just, not literally speaking, but as a useful contrivance for how to as a shorthand, I guess you could say. When I say, if I point to an actual instance of a person seeing someone hit someone else and going, that's morally wrong, what that person is doing, they're engaged in moral discourse or moral language. Or let's say two people are arguing. One person says, that's wrong. No, it's not wrong. And they're having an argument. That's an instance of people making moral claims. In other words, I take moral claims, like the subject of study, to be an actual instance of a person deploying the language in the real world. And we could talk about hypothetical things that are supposed to like hypothetical sentences, and then try to think about and theorize what could be true of those. But to me, I see those as a sort of way of it's sort of extra empirical theorizing, which is not useless. Someone could say, hey, what if we did this experiment where we took a dog and we fed it this and we put it in this situation, or we took a pigeon, or we took a rabbit and we did that. So experimenters that are doing behavioral research on animals can think up hypothetical scenarios and then go, what would happen if we did this? But if you want to know what the animal would actually do, you got to test it. And it's the same thing with evaluating the meaning of moral claims. We actually have to evaluate the actual moral claims, not just hypothetical moral claims. So, and a common example is people will say, hey, look, there's a huge problem with non-cognitivism. It's obviously ridiculous because of the Frege-Geach problem. You're going to have this issue where, if you're a non-cognitivist and you don't think moral claims are propositional, well, hey, look, I can make this argument like, hey, all assassinations are wrong. All murders are wrong. Assassination is a type of murder. Therefore, assassination is wrong. So, hey, it looks like moral claims can figure into arguments, which means that they play the role of propositions. Propositions, just by definition, which I agree with. I don't deny all analytic facts, or, just by definition, propositions are capable of being true or false, or truth apt. So looks like moral claims are truth apt. Problem solved. Non-cognitivism done. Now, it's funny because when I present the unintelligibility thesis, some people have objected by saying it's ridiculous. Lance's view is ridiculous because it's how plausible is it that all of these philosophers could be so conceptually or linguistically confused that they're asserting nonsense and don't realize it. Okay, so let's say that that's really uncharitable, right? So it's implausible. Okay, so there are non-cognitivists. We could go look at the Phil paper survey and see non-cognitivists. Now, if you think that Frege gauge or embedding or whatever, these certain sorts of linguistic analyses, did I just demolish non-cognitivism in 30 seconds? Because you will see cognitivists, they don't even have to be realists, cognitivists will take themselves to have completely destroyed non-cognitivism in like 30 seconds. So on their view, so the non-cognitivists apparently does not have unintelligible views or conceptual confusions, and they're not saying meaningless things. They're saying meaningful things, but what? They're so bad at reasoning and thinking, they can't realize that you have a knockdown argument. So within the contemporary analytic dialectic, it looks like people will often frame views that are held by their rivals and colleagues as being completely and easily and totally refuted. And their colleagues, presumably, if they're not conceptually or linguistically confused, have all the resources in the world they need. They don't need to do empirical research. They don't need psychological studies. They just need to think about it. And apparently, what are you implying? That they're so bad at thinking about things, they can't realize that you easily demolish their position and they persist in spite of that? How is that more charitable than me saying maybe there's a more fundamental or and deeper conceptual problem here? Because I'm not attributing the mistakes that I think anti-realists and realists are making to them being obviously wrong in this really simple and straightforward way. And yet it seems like, what, do they think this about one another? That they're all making these really obvious and say, hey, you got all the resources and tools, but you're just not good at evaluating arguments? So that's totally fine. But if I come along and I say, hey, maybe you're metaphilosophical, maybe you have background presuppositions or presumptions about how language and meaning work that are wrong, and then downstream of it, you're all making a bunch of mistakes. That's super implausible. I don't think so. I think it's more plausible that the field would be making sort of shared mistakes than that individuals within the field are using excellent, adequate, perfectly good tools and publish work on this, and they're super smart and capable and competent and well-read, and they just persist in obvious, stupid mistakes. That strikes me as really implausible and very uncharitable. So something is going wrong here. People are, I don't have an issue with people thinking other people are making huge mistakes. I do think, though, that when people think other people are making huge mistakes, it's usually, I think if they are making huge mistakes, it's going to be due to some implicit presuppositions that aren't shared between those two people. In some cases, it could be due to incorrigible differences in their starting intuitions. But if philosophers think that's going on, they got a bigger problem than I do, because if they think, ultimately these intuitions, like a lot of them are just not going to think that, I think. But if philosophers are unable to reach convergence using philosophical methods because of these incorrigible initial starting points that are totally different from one another, in other words, just imagine people start out doing contemporary analytic metaphysics and they're just using a priori and armchair methods to reason through things. And some people, or they start out with a prior for non-cognitivism that's like 0.99, and other people start out with cognitivism at 0.99. All the arguments in the world might only be able to shift people by, 0.1 or 0.2. And so you have the dialectic start out. Everybody presents their arguments. Let's say most of the arguments favor cognitivism. And at the end of the day, the non-cognitivists shift to 0.79. They still favor non-cognitivism. And now the cognitivists, maybe they bump themselves up to 0.999. But at the end of the day, there's no dialectical progress. Everybody has the views they started with. So if you think that people are that incorrigible, that's a problem. But when philosophers do change their minds, like you see convergence in the field over time, what is causing the convergence? Is it the quality of the arguments? How representative of the arguments? How representative are the published arguments of the overall quality of the available arguments for and against a particular position? Is it necessarily going to represent the strength of the arguments? I very much doubt it, because what's actually causing papers to get published? Is it the quality of the papers? And is there equal representation at the outset of inquiry for alternative views, or is there proportionate representation to their initial plausibility? I don't know, probably not. There's going to be all these unknown social and cultural factors that are influencing which views are popular. It could be just a chance stochastic processes lead there to be an initial, like you can imagine a situation like this. you start out with, there's no preference for a particular philosophical view. Let's go with realism and anti-realism. It starts out, there's no particular preference for or against realism or anti-realism, but there's one really popular realist, let's say. And that realist writes a bunch of work. Everybody loves it. The person themselves has a really magnetic personality. They're really charismatic. Everybody loves them. And this person draws people that share their point of view and their perspective to the field. And those people drive away people that don't share their point of view. So you get this sort of, that person serves as a sort of a dialectical magnet or attractor for people that share their views and pushes other people away. And over time, you generate this consensus merely in virtue of the force of personality of this particular initial figure. And so you get this effect of and you can imagine what happens 50 or 100 years later. People come along and they say, hey, maybe anti-realism is the right view. And they go, look, the field has settled the matter. So run along now, get out of here. And so this can happen with respect to particular points of views for reasons other than the merits of the arguments, due to all the biases that are influencing who is holding these views. Now, since philosophers, they're relying on these a priori or armchair methods, have no external means of corroboration. Compare this to engineers, doctors, chefs, chess players. These are the typical examples I give. If someone says they're better than you at chess, they could easily test. They could just play you in chess, and if they beat you 100 times in a row, yeah, they're probably better than you. I mean, assuming you know you're trying and they're winning. Chef can cook food. You can see if it tastes good. Someone can build a bridge, see if it stands up. Doctor can save a bunch of patients' lives. There are external means where if a doctor says I'm really good at doing my job and I don't believe them, they could go and save a bunch of people's lives. And they think, okay, well, they're achieving what there's some externally measurable success condition. What are the externally measurable success conditions for super duper abstract metaphysical accounts in philosophy? As far as I can tell, there aren't any. And in fact, there aren't any by the lights of the people putting these forward. There's no external means of corroboration. They're not even, and that's not even on their view a flaw. They're like, it's not intended to do that. And so when you have these disputes among analytic philosophers and they're arguing about these sorts of things, and there's no external corroboration, what do we rely on? Apparently their expertise. But did they ever demonstrate their expertise at getting it? Again, I am not challenging that they are, or at least can be, experts at logic and analysis of arguments, and they're really, really good at breaking down and extracting the meaning of written argumentative work. Also at drawing really clear conceptual distinctions, identifying instances of ambiguity. We can have a very, very long list of the skills and abilities that philosophers develop or possess that shows that they're super duper skilled at a whole bunch of stuff. But are they skilled at getting correct philosophical answers? Okay, well, how would you demonstrate that? Do we accept that? Because they could say, well, we got to start somewhere. We need intuitions. Okay, but are your intuitions like well calibrated? Are they reliable? They might say, well, most of us think this way, and we've thought about it a whole lot, so it must be right. And here's where the kicker comes in. If the initial group of people are psychologically unrepresentative of the rest of the world's population, and if something about the degree to which their particular psychological idiosyncrasies are shared between them and not shared between other people, you could get a very high starting rate, or whatever it is. It could be that 80% of them start out with an inclination towards realism. And even if the field shifted them downwards a bit, it could still be 70, 60%. The point would be, if the rest of the population, were they to think about the issues, wouldn't have had that same proportion of people endorsing that view. Well, what if we had everybody in the world, suppose space aliens come down and they create an exact copy of our entire planet, and in fact, our entire universe, they plop it into a simulation, and then they mess with the simulation. So they make everybody in the universe have all the resources and abilities and make them all be professional philosophers. And then they all bring their education and culture and background and all their characteristics to bear on these philosophical questions. Then we see what all 8 billion people on Earth would think after they've reflected on these philosophical issues. And what if the proportion of them that endorse realism is 30% or 40%? Okay, now what? So the issue is that if philosophers are taking themselves to be experts on these issues, the proportion of philosophers that endorse a particular position is not going to be perfectly independent of the degree of potential psychological and cultural biases that are influencing their sort of starting point and where they arrive at. And it's worse than that, because you can imagine, okay, so imagine we were teaching analytic philosophy, like current analytic philosophical methods, we take a population and we put them on an island or like a hypothetical universe, and they're like 100% of them are super duper religious of a particular religion. and then we teach them analytic philosophy, and then we see how many continue endorsing that religion after they do undergraduate and PhD, and let's say they spend 10, 12 years studying. Would you expect, like, let's say atheism is the correct view, just for the sake of argument, I don't care if you're an atheist or not. Let's say it's the correct view. Would you expect 100% of them to be atheists? I would expect almost none of them to be. Why? Well, if it's an isolated group of people that all share the same religious views as one another, and they're all studying the topic together, I would expect them not to change very much, because I would expect part of what would cause people to become atheists is if other members of the community are atheists. It's not like they're all going to go start examining the arguments in an unbiased way. They're going to come up with all these amazing arguments for atheism and all collectively go, oh shit, I guess the preponderance of the argumentative merits for atheism is so much better than for our religion. We have to abandon it. That wouldn't happen. They'd still almost all be religious. And so the perspective, the psychological perspective of the people starting out is going to be a massive factor in where they end up, regardless of whether they're taught the analytic philosophical method. So that's going to be a big factor. Then another big factor is the culture and community that you move into. So say you took a group of 100 people that are super duper religious and you put them into an academic community. And let's say it's super insular. Again, we can imagine putting them all on an island where they only talk to one another. And let's say it's a group of however many, I don't have a good estimate of the amount of professional philosophers in the US. Let's say it's 30, 40,000. Let's say it's something like that, 30,000. So you put this 100 into a group of 30,000 philosophers. Well, the vast majority of them are atheists, or at least are non-theists of whatever, they could call themselves agnostics or whatever. Now, what do you think would happen after 10 or 12 years? I would bet you quite a few of those 100 people that initially started out super religious would fall into a couple additional categories. So some, I think, would remain very religious, especially, so I'll get to this, but some of them would remain very religious. Some, I think, would become less religious or had more tempered views, and some would just abandon the religion and become atheists. Now, what we would expect is true of the ones that remain super religious. I would expect they're the ones that are form a tight-knit religious community within that broader population. So they're only 100 out of the 35,000 or whatever, but the ones that spend the most time hanging out with each other and not everybody else. So people exert enormous social influence on one another. And I think philosophers have fundamentally failed to appreciate that philosophy as a discipline forms a subculture. And when you enter into philosophy, you're entering into a field where the existing proportion of people that endorse a particular view is going to influence what people think in that field. And I suspect that if you get a weight of people in favor of a view, that it starts to exert a kind of inertia that pushes the whole field towards that view. It can snowball. So, you can imagine a scenario like this. Right now, we have 62% of philosophers endorsing moral realism. 10 years ago or so, about 11 years ago, technically, it was 2009, 2020, it was 56%. That bump of 6% just extrapolated into the future. What if every 11 years it increases by 6%? Are we going to see by the end of the century everybody be a realist or very close to it or something like that? I don't know if it would be exactly 6%, but let's say at some high rate, someone in the chat could do all the math and we could find out, what exactly it would look like. So what is everybody going to be a realist by 2100? I doubt it, but they could be. Is that an indication that realism is true? We can imagine something like this. If the proportion of philosophers that endorse a view is evidence for the view, you could get this sort of this bootstrapping effect. So, let's say for each person, they have their degree of phenomenal conservative. It's not even phenomenal conservatism. They're whatever amount of weight they put on their seemings. So, for one person, it's only a 1 out of 100 for how much it seems realism is true. Another's 50, another's 100, another's 72. So each one of those people, they have evidence for and against moral realism. And for some people, the gap is here. For some people, it's smaller. For some people, it's smaller still. And let's say you add to the weight of the evidence the proportion of philosophers, and the greater the proportion of philosophers that endorse realism, the greater the weight of evidence that realism is true. So at 62%, it's not that big of a preference for realism. I should note, it doesn't mean the other 38% are anti-realists. I think it's something like 26% are anti-realists. And then there's another percentage that endorses a variety of other views. They had a bunch of other options. So it's not 2 to 1. It's actually more like 2.5 to 1 in favor of realism versus anti-realism. So the scenario is worse than just most philosophers are more realists. Only a quarter are anti-realists and about 2/3 are realists. Anyway, and that's just the actual scenario. But here we're in a hypothetical scenario. So we're at 62, right? So for one person where the threshold is very close, the 62 is just enough to bump them over the edge. They become a realist, bumps up to 63%. Then it causes this domino effect. Another person that for them, it needed to be 63% for that to be convincing. So that bumps them up to 64%. And you can see it goes all the way up to wherever the limit is, where there's people where the gap isn't able to close. And that could be at 70% or 75% or 80%. And so then all those people that have shifted over, that becomes this big looming weight of evidence in favor of the view. And so it could be evidence for the view that people are shifted over. But note that the quality of the evidence, like whether or not realism is true doesn't merely depend on what a bunch of people happen to believe, independently of all the other reasons and arguments that are considerations for and against the view. We would have to look at those. And I'm sure that people that think the proportion of philosophers that endorse a view as some evidence don't think the other considerations don't matter. But I think people are insensitive to the cultural and social forces that are driving these considerations. And they're not appreciating, for instance, whether or not and to what extent weird cultures are more likely to have a very high initial starting point towards a disposition towards realism, or a very high tendency in virtue of path-dependent features of the way that Western philosophy developed. It could be that, we have people have said philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. So we have Plato. Plato had these particularly metaphysically very heavy worldview. Plato and Aristotle, all this stuff was preserved and then incorporated and filtered through Christianity. You have Aquinas, and then you have all of philosophy being sort of passed through the filter of a particularly Christian lens before you had this more recent secular turn within the history of Western philosophy. Now, having passed through that and gone through the sort of the sort of cultural legacy of a distinctively monotheistic worldview. Well, part of that worldview was this very Manichaean perspective on where there was this very strong sense towards a dichotomous sense of good and evil. And people think of there's God versus Satan, and that characterization. That perspective of there being goodness and badness, and it having these sort of divine origins in like God in his righteousness, and Satan is this vicious evil creature. There's this, you see these motifs all over the place. Good and evil's all over. It's in the, it's totally suffused through our culture. And so people are generation after generation after generation growing up in a world where things are characterized in terms of this dichotomy between good and evil. And so even after the recent decline in Christianity, and even after the recession of philosophical views totally saturating philosophy, most philosophers now are atheists. But how much does that cultural legacy of a conception of good and evil influence the sort of a cultural package they come loaded with when they start doing philosophy? I think it matters a whole lot. And that it could be that no matter, that initial starting point biases people so much towards having this inclination to think that realism is true, that the proportion of philosophers that endorse realism is how much is that an artifact of the distinctive cultural and historical and path-dependent legacy of Western philosophy on through contemporary analytic philosophy, and the specific religious and cultural history of the particular people that are studying in the field, and even people that don't come. On top of that, this is further reinforced by the fact that, let's say that you don't come from an American Christian background and you study contemporary analytic metaethics. Okay, but if you start studying it and start learning and reading, what are you going to be introduced to if you're taking courses in a graduate program in the analytic tradition in the United States? Well, you're going to be introduced to a bunch of thinkers that were part of that. And so everyone is going to get introduced to the same sort of canon of thinkers. And, are you going to have people that, that didn't read Kant, that didn't read Hume? I mean, some maybe, but for the most part, people in analytic philosophy are reading the same texts, and those texts come from people that whose philosophical background is fully saturated in this particular legacy. How much does that influence thinkers in the field? Bottom line is, I don't know, but neither do the people in the field that seem to downplay the degree to which that 62% are moral realists. How much is that due to Christian influence, for instance? I don't know. I bet it's a lot. I mean, some of those people are literally Christians that think this because they subscribe to Christian theological views. That's going to be a pretty big chunk of them, like a pretty big chunk. So is that irrelevant? Irrelevant. No, it's not going to be irrelevant. So then the question is, how much does it matter? You remove Christianity from the picture and you had some secular worldview established 2 or 3,000 years ago, what would the modern landscape look like? I doubt it would be 62%. It'd be some different percentage, maybe be 90%. I don't know. The bottom line is we don't know, because we don't know what all of these factors do to influence the proportion of people that endorse different views. It's almost as if philosophers think the proportion of people that endorse views is completely dependent on the quality of the arguments, like not even the actual arguments for and against these views. It's as if they think that the proportion of people is directly an indication of the quality of the possibility space of arguments for and against these views. I very much doubt people actually think that, but I don't understand why what the preponderance of philosophers think is taken to be that diagnostic or that informative. And yet so many people take this to be this really, really, really big factor. And if not a lot of people think a particular view, it's dismissed. Oh, well, no one thinks that way. Okay, well, yeah, no one thinks that way. I'm not asking a question of whether most people think that way. I'm asking the question of whether we should think this, given some intersubjective agreements about what philosophical principles and concerns matter to us. Does it matter to you whether the particular cultural or religious or philosophical or whatever background you have influences the way you think in ways that are not truth tracking? Matters to me. So I care about this. I presume other people care about this, and they would care about the fact that had history gone very, imagine contemporary, like all of Plato's and Aristotle's works were lost, and instead the philosophers that we have fragments from, like the atomists and stuff, imagine we had preserved all of their works, like big volumes of their works. I don't know, Epicurus or something like that. So we had a whole bunch of Epicurus and we didn't have any Plato and Aristotle. What would modern philosophy look like? Would it look the same? I bet it wouldn't. What would it look like? What would it look like? I have no idea. What would modern philosophers think? I don't know. The bottom line is we don't know how path dependent the field actually is. We don't have access to the counterfactuals in which the history of philosophy went very differently. We could try to imagine it, but that is far beyond the scope of people's imaginative capacities. We can't simulate alternative histories of 2,000 years and simulate everything that happens. We can't do that. So we don't know. And we don't have a crystal ball. There's no way for us to find out. There is a way for us to find out. We could study how much cultural factors and background and these sorts of factors influence human psychology. To what degree is the proportion of people that are for or against a particular philosophical position dependent on this or that particular psychological mechanism? How do those psychological mechanisms operate? To what degree are they shaped, like our epistemic practices? How much are those shaped by our enculturation and our education and our training? What possible alternative types of education and training could we have? And would those have been types of methods that could be, alternative methods for thinking about these sorts of things that are no less viable? I just don't know. And it looks to me, I'm not saying, there's experimental philosophers, there's philosophers that care about the empirical stuff and they think that it matters. But you do have an undercurrent of disinterest, disdain, and hostility towards these views within the field of analytic philosophy. And I think that's a bad thing. But on the other hand, you have, I'll give one example of someone that literally does this work. So you have Josh Green. So Josh Green proposed the dual process model of moral cognition. And this dual process model is in some ways modeled after the dual process model of cognition more generally, which figures into the heuristics and biases research. But I'll just focus on the morality thing. It's basically the same, but applied to morality. Okay, so basically, there are these two distinct modes of thought people can adopt when engaging in moral reasoning and deliberation and judgment. One of these systems is quicker, it's more emotion-based, it's more intuitive, it's more automatic, it's less inferential, it's less, maybe there's other features, it's quicker, it's less sequential and principle-based. So you have this one system that's more, what's the output? Then you have this other system that's more deliberative and principled and slower and reasoning, and you think through it and it takes longer and it's more effortful. So there's this sort of cluster. It's like you could say there are these two nomological clusters of characteristics that center around these two modes of thought. And so you have these two distinct types of psychological mechanisms. Now, the first one of these mechanisms, we'll call it, I think it's typically called system one, system two. So system one, that tends to, when you're presented with normative moral cases like the trolley problem and the footbridge problem, like the footbridge problem. When you're presented with the footbridge problem, that tends to deliver this deontological output. It's principle and rule based. You tend to just say it's wrong because it's wrong to, cause unnecessary harm or whatever. That might be the rationale you give. It doesn't mean that that's actually what's actually causing the judgment to deliver the output. In fact, Green thinks it's not. It's going to be some other sorts of considerations. Anyway, so then you have the other system, and that system is more consequentialist. It's focused more on crunching the numbers and doing the calculations. You could think of it as more cold in a certain sort of respect. And so these two systems deliver different types of outputs. The system one delivers deontological outputs, system two delivers consequentialist outputs. And then what Green argues is that system one is more subject to various sorts of biasing or distorting influences, where on reflection, when we consider what factors are relevant to that system, we don't think that they are the sorts of factors that should be driving our judgments. For instance, Green did a bunch of research showing that one of the big factors here is whether people are making physical contact with a person. So you have the classic cases. I'll go over them just as a review for people. I'm sure everybody knows about trolley problems. So the classic cases are the switch case and the footbridge case. In the switch case, there's a train headed down the tracks. It's going to hit 5 people. This is a thought experiment. So you don't get to say, well, I'll shout at the 5 people, or I'll jump in front of the tracks, or, the train would be able to stop in time. No, it's headed down the tracks. It's going to hit the 5 people. It's going to kill the 5 people. There's nothing. You only have 2 options here. There's a switch. You could not pull the switch. It'll continue down the track and kill the 5 people. You can pull the switch. It will divert the train onto a sidetrack, or hit 1 person instead. You only have 2 options. Don't pull the switch. It kills 5 people. Do pull the switch. You divert it onto a sidetrack. It hits 1 person. When Green has conducted these surveys, I think it tends to be about 80 to 90% of the participants. And I don't know how cross-cultural these findings are, but they seem to replicate well. And I think that it's pretty representative of how at least a lot of populations respond. Where people say, yeah, it's permissible, at least permissible to pull the switch. It's like, it's okay to do that. But then the footbridge case, you could push a person off of a bridge. So the train's headed down the tracks. It's going to hit the 5 people. There's no sidetrack. There's no switch this time. Train headed down the tracks. It's going to hit 5 people, and it's going to kill them. And you're standing there, and you could push another person off of the bridge, and they'll fall, and they'll die on impact. And then their body will stop the train. Now, never mind how, again, people will often say it's not plausible, but just imagine a hypothetical where this is plausible. I'm sympathetic to people saying give a more realistic scenario. I'm totally on board with that. But this is what we got. And I like the trolley problem. And so I don't have a problem with them. And I don't have a problem with implausible scenarios either, personally, but I understand that people do. Anyway, so Green did a bunch of experiments of variations on things like, what if you poke the person off the bridge with a pole, that sort of thing. And it looks like, if you look at the factors driving this, people just don't want it to cause a person's death by making physical contact with them, but they're okay with it if they don't have to make physical contact. Now, on reflection, is it more morally permissible to kill a person without making physical contact than by making physical contact? All else being equal, if you killed someone with a spear, is that less bad? Because it's, if you kill them with your fist or a spear or like a remote control drone, and it's like the same amount of pain and you control all the other variables, is it any morally different? It doesn't seem like it, at least to me and to most people. I think, I don't know if it's been studied. There's an empirical claim. So the point would be, if on reflection, we don't think that the particular way holding everything else constant matters, that's going to be one factor that is going to be this biasing or distorting influence. It doesn't seem like that should be relevant to the judgment. And Green might cite other sorts of considerations for why the system one outputs are less reliable, they're less trustworthy, because they're sensitive to these distorting factors. So the point here would be that if you're delivering moral judgments, the consequentialist ones are more trustworthy than the deontological ones, because they're the result of a process that's less subject to biasing and distorting influences. Now, that is what I'm talking about. Now, by the way, I'm not like opposed to the dual process model, but I'm not convinced by it either. So you could say I'm agnostic and pretty skeptical of that particular model, but I like that kind of approach to addressing these sorts of questions, because what it's doing is it's saying, hey, look, this is not just delivering a uniform output that's either fully reliable or not reliable, or reliable to a certain degree. There's different mechanisms. They operate in different ways. They're subject to different inputs and outputs. If the fact that one is reliable does not entail that the other is reliable. And so it turns out that we can sort of selectively debunk. We could say we can debunk this particular type of normative moral judgment, deontological judgments. Those are more suspect than the consequentialist ones. Now, then the question is, when philosophers are reporting all these intellectual, if someone's reporting a metaethical judgment, they're reporting a realist judgment, and I report an anti-realist judgment. Are those the results of the same types of psychological processes? I don't know. I know there's been a little bit of work on this, but the point is here that there's very little consideration for what psychological mechanisms are involved in any given instance of a philosopher reporting a judgment or making a claim. Is that mechanism the result of the same mechanism that they're using in some other instance? We don't know. Are those mechanisms equally reliable? We don't know. Are there two different mechanisms or only one mechanism? We don't know. Are there 12 mechanisms, 30 mechanisms? How many mechanisms are there? We don't know. We don't know the answers to most of these questions. And it also looks like a lot of philosophers don't seem to care. They don't seem to think any of this matters. And I think it does matter. And like basically they're using a tool. The tool is the human mind. This is something I mentioned like 2 hours ago at this point. But they don't seem to want to know how it works or care. It's very strange. It's very strange. It's, imagine if physicists simply didn't care if barometers and thermometers and all their tools were well calibrated. Or imagine if they just said, look, we just give physics outputs, physics output using which instrument. So no, that's not how they work. Physicists are going to be deeply concerned with checking the calibration of their instruments, ensuring they're functioning, testing their functioning over and over and over and over and being sure they work, looking for manufacturing defects, devising these based on sound theoretical principles that have themselves been well tested and stood up to empirical confirmation. Now, I'm not saying physicists do everything perfectly. I'm sure if you go and you look at published work in pretty much any scientific field, you're going to find big methodological gaps and problems and issues. What I am saying, though, is that at least there is an interest and a concern in really having a deep understanding of the methods and tools that are in use in these other fields. Physicists care about whether their instruments work. Chemists care about whether, the solutions that they have the right proportion of this or that chemical in them or whatever. I don't know how chemists do their work, but I'm assuming that they care and that they care whether, for instance, if a chemist is going to care about whether the stuff they're using is contaminated with something else or not. They're going to care about that. So in all of the scientific fields, people are at least nominally concerned with evaluating the quality and efficacy and reliability and calibration of the instruments and tools they're using. Philosophers, not only, for the most part, I'm not saying nobody ever cares about this, but sure some people do, they don't seem to care. They don't seem to know about they don't seem to agree on what the tools are. They don't seem to agree on whether or not and how the tools work. They don't seem to be particularly curious about what those tools are and how they work. They don't seem to be studying what those tools are and how they work. And then when people come along and propose that we do experimental philosophy or cognitive science, or that psychology should have some bearing on these philosophical questions, what you see is a reaction of some people saying, okay, yeah, sure. If it's relevant, we'll consider it, which I agree. It's not like let's all quit philosophy and hand it over to psychologists. I would never suggest we do that. I think philosophers are super useful. If anything, I think sprinkle the philosophers in all the scientific fields. I think there should be lots of philosophers working with lots of people in all of the sciences and all of the practical and applied fields. I think philosophers have a super valuable toolkit. Conceptual clarity and disambiguation is a big deal. Look, in my psychological work, I critique a lot of the psychological research for being totally insensitive to issues of ambiguity and conceptual distinctions that philosophers would have a field day with. I had an experience where a colleague of mine, they were a philosopher, and I brought them to a psychology talk, and they were like, I'm not sure, that I'm really going to be able to connect with this content and material, and I'm not sure. And a person was presenting, and their feedback that they gave was awesome. They were like, did you distinguish between this operational and that? Like, I don't even know if they were using any specific psychological jargon, but their feedback and their comments were, I have this dim recollection of exactly what happened, but I have the impression that the person that was speaking was like, your contributions are amazing. Like, thank you. And so I think philosophers can do a lot to contribute to psychology and to other fields, but I also think those other fields can contribute a lot more to philosophy than philosophers appreciate. And that an interdisciplinary approach is the way to go. And so, I'm not as knowledgeable of a lot of the work in analytic philosophy that I would like to be more familiar with. On the other hand, I also think that a lot of philosophers aren't as familiar with, for instance, work on cross-cultural differences in human psychology. They're not as familiar with moral psychology. They're not as familiar with a wide variety of empirical considerations that come from disciplines outside the field that I think are extremely relevant to doing philosophical work. And it baffles me that this isn't taken seriously by the field as a whole. I'm not saying it's not taken seriously. You have people like Stitch, who does this kind of research. So Stitch doesn't just do philosophy. Stitch does empirical work and engages with empirical work and writes about it. So, for instance, Stitch has written a lot on the research by Turiel and some other people on the moral conventional distinction. So there's this long line of developmental psychological research, which purports to show that there's this early emerging, if not, it's not in every culture, but in many cultures at least, tendency for children, and this continues on into adulthood, to reliably distinguish between moral norms and social norms by recognizing a certain cluster of, like this nomological cluster of characteristics that are associated with prototypical moral judgments and prototypical social conventional judgments. And so this research purports to show that people draw this distinction on the basis of the moral judgments being authority independent, universalizable, and they tend to be justified in terms of harm, justice, and fairness and rights and those sorts of things. Whereas the social conventions tend to be authority dependent, they tend to be not universalizable, and they tend not to be justified in those terms. I don't recall exactly what terms they're justified in terms of. So Stitch and some other philosophers have looked into this research, they've criticized this research, and I think a lot of the criticisms are very strong. That, it's not to say that these findings won't replicate a particular population. It looks like they do. But the boundaries are more porous. There's been some research showing that the distinction breaks down at the edges, and that you'll get some populations or some issues where the issues seem to have some of the characteristics and not the others, so they don't neatly fall into one of the two categories, or you'll find populations that don't exhibit the tendency to draw this distinction. And so a lot of that research is really interesting. I think it's relevant. I think part of the reason it's relevant is that you do have these approaches from, again, the research is often interdisciplinary. You do have philosophers doing this work and psychologists and anthropologists and other people, where what they found is that if you try to draw a principal distinction between moral and non-moral norms, turns out philosophically speaking, that's extremely difficult. But it also turns out that that's very difficult psychologically speaking. Now, you can always operationalize. Well, you could just say, by morality, I just mean this, and then go out and find patterns that conform to that. And you can say, look, I'm going to say that morality just is any system of norms shared between a group of an interacting population that facilitates cooperation within that population. And that's what I mean by moral norms. But then you could go talk to those people and try to say, hey, what do you think about moral issues and meta-ethics? And they could go, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have those concepts. What are you talking about? And so that doesn't mean that they don't have moral concepts or that they don't have a moral system. It's just that, like, if you just stipulate or an operationalization, philosophers could appeal to something very similar to Moore's open question argument. Say, why should we consider that philosophy? Why is philosophy going to be any system of norms of cooperation that exists within a population? We think morality is about these concerns. Or they might say morality is sui generis or non-natural, and it's just not reducible to these you could say to the psychologist, you're taking this operationalization to skip over the dispute between moral non-naturalists and naturalists. And we don't think you can naturalize morality in the way that you're proposing to do. And we think that there's background philosophical concerns to raise here. I don't disagree with them. I don't think psychologists can just leap over those questions, but sometimes they do. And I don't buy into it when they do. So I am not always on the side of hyper scientific and empirical approaches that I think skip over the philosophical considerations that I consider relevant to this sort of thing. So all of that is to say, I think that there are really, really, really deep issues here. And I think that psychology is super relevant. I don't think philosophers take it as seriously as they should. Okay, let me, I think I've totally failed to catch up with what people are saying in the chat. I also haven't seen anything in a while. So maybe I don't know if people have just been like, okay, Lance isn't going to respond to the chat, but let's see. I got to go back up to more than an hour ago. Wow. Okay. All right. I'm still going up. Okay. So now we're to an hour and a half ago. But if you got other questions, well, oh, wow. So much more being said. All right. Okay, so I'm back to 5. Okay, that was 2 hours ago. Wow, I've been going at this for 2 hours. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we have Majesty of Reason back from a couple hours ago. So I'm finally getting the comments from a couple hours ago. Lance is once more fighting hard, suppressing the truth of moral realism in unrighteousness. I love that phrasing, in unrighteousness. It's a lot of fun. I know you're probably gone for like well over an hour, but I do appreciate people jumping in and saying this. It's good to add a little bit of levity that I'm comfortable with here. All right, let's see. Do you have a view on whether numbers in and of themselves are intelligible? I can picture one dog, but not one. I'm hoping you convey the concept of them to me. Good question. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into that. So I don't know if I could convey the concept of one to you. What I can say is that numeric concepts, like these mathematical concepts, I think they can be used in ways that are useful, and that's good enough for me. So that's what I would do with them. I'm going to give some sort of account where I'm going to cash them out in terms of what can be done with them. What I'm not going to do is try to reify the notion of a one and think that like one is a thing, but mathematical discourse at the very least is extraordinarily useful in a wide variety of ways. And I don't think that its utility requires one to have strong commitments about, you don't have to be a mathematical Platonist. You could be a nominalist or something like that. And it's not going to require you to have a bunch of what I would consider to be questionable metaphysical views. All right. So we have a few more comments. This person is asking Majesty of Reason. If you don't know, that's Joe. Will you ever have Lance on your channel? I could just say I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but not a whole lot. I would love to come on the channel at some point. So let's see. Okay, so I'll get to that. I'm just going to move through this because I see it looks like there's a response, which it looks like, yes, I want him on the channel. So I'll get to that. So here, I read the last time you suggested, I recall hearing the stasis condition point and being like, thank God someone else feels this way. Yeah, so this is going all the way back a few hours ago. I can't believe I'm going this long on this. I'm all fired up today, I guess. Yeah, so the stasis condition, really have a look at that paper. Bishop and Trout, Pathologies of Standard Analytic Epistemology. I love that paper. Okay, so Majesty of Reason. Yes, I want to get him on to talk about his dissertation. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that research. That would be great. I will say, I don't know how excited people are going to be to get into the psychology. I know I've sometimes, in some of my earlier streams, I've talked about the psychology metaethics. So again, I do have to stress, I do psychology metaethics. That's my area of specialization. It's not technically, my focus for years has been specifically this empirical work on whether or not non-philosophers are realists or anti-realists. So that's the big thing I focus on. But I don't talk about it quite as much as I talk about what looks like I've fallen into talking about metaphilosophy and realism and anti-realism. But I should talk about that more. And I know I've asked, I get kind of a lot of people say that they're interested in that, but I don't know. I haven't talked about it enough to see the kind of reaction people have to be talking about that research. But if you're curious, so what I do in my research is I take existing research that has been used to examine, to address the question, are non-philosophers moral realists? And what I've done is I've looked into that research and I started examining people's, how the participants were interpreting the questions in these studies. And I used a variety of different methods to assess how they interpret them. And what I argue is that the participants are consistently interpreting the questions about metaethics in a variety of ways unrelated to researcher intent, meaning that if the researcher poses a question, let's just take a super simplified way of that. Hey, do you think do you think morality is objective? And then someone says yes. Does that mean the person's a moral realist? Or you might think yes, but you have to pause and go, well, wait, what does the participant think it means for morality to be objective? And you can ask them, well, what do you think it means for morality to be objective? And they say, oh, well, I think it means that we can agree upon some shared standards for evaluating whether an action is right or wrong. Are they a realist? It doesn't look like it to me. So some people, they take objective to mean something like there's some publicly valuable standard that we can agree on. So like rulers provide objective information about measurement. And there's a certain sense in which a ruler, like using inches or centimeters or something, does provide a stance-independent fact about the distance between two objects or the length of something. In another respect, like the actual units, of course, that's constructed. And so if a person says we can agree on standards for building moral systems, and then if we agree on them, then there's facts about what's true or false relative to the standard, that person might be some type of constructivist, and then they're not necessarily a realist. And so we don't know without further elaboration and discussion. One big influence on this that influenced me was this great paper. It's called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. It's from Competent. It was published way back in 2007, before I was studying much of this stuff. And in that paper, Competent makes this point where it's like, look, if you really wanted to know whether a person is if you're conducting this experimental philosophy, there's various sorts of considerations you need to keep in mind. The person has to not be attentive to all these pragmatic influences. They're not giving you their sort of pure semantic judgment. They need to not be subject to various sorts of biasing influences. They need to be competent in the relevant considerations and discourse. And this sets a very high epistemic bar. And it's a bar that the participants in experimental philosophical studies are probably not reaching. And so, the results of these studies may not be diagnostic about what those people think. Now, I took that criticism to heart. I think there's a lot of merit in that. I don't think that the solution is let's go back to doing philosophy as normal in quite the same respect that I think that the author wants to. But I do think that there's a strong reason to suspect that participants are being asked questions that are so difficult to interpret without a background in philosophy that it's unclear, and they're so ambiguous a lot of times. Subjective. So it's not like people are hearing the word objective and going, what is that? I've never heard the word objective. They have heard the word objective. It's just that the word objective has lots of different uses. Sometimes objective means like unbiased. The judge is very objective in their judgments. Does that mean they're very stance independent in their judgments? No, it means they're not biased. That's a perfectly colloquial, conventional, totally sensible use of the term. Just the bottom line is objective has all, and it's not like there's like 5 discrete uses of objective. The way words actually work in language, which again, why don't philosophers care about this? They should, is words have like shadings and gradations of usage. And also the way words actually work in practice is they're not just about pure semantics. Words are embedded in a broader linguistic sort of population. So a word, its meaning isn't solely determined and isolated from the rest of the words around it, or from the social context in which it tends to be used. And so words are often used and deployed in conditions where pragmatic considerations are a feature of why the person would opt to use the word in the first place. So extracting the pragmatics from one's analysis of the meaning of the word doesn't make any sense. And so you could say, okay, well, but pragmatics saw the non-semantic contextual factors that figure into the meaning. You can't analyze the meaning of the sentence without considering those contextual factors, because how could I analyze this hypothetical moral sentence, quote, murder is wrong, outside of a context? I agree. You can't analyze it. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any meaning without the pragmatics. No meaning, none. I don't think words have any meaning outside of context of usage. And so that would be just the point. So if someone says, well, they wouldn't have any meaning, well, we wouldn't be able to analyze them without those considerations. I agree. And if they say we can analyze them without those meanings, okay, well, now you're throwing out elements that I think are essential to their meaning. And so we're going to have core disagreements about language underlying this. Anyway, so basically what I argue there is that the participants in psychological research that are being, let me start over. What I argue is that all this research on the psychology of metaethics that purports to show these different proportions of the degree to which the tested populations endorse realism or anti-realism rely on measures that are largely not valid and don't tell us whether or not those people are realists or anti-realists. And I think the best explanation for the data, the fact that people consistently, reliably, and frequently do not interpret these questions in line with researcher intent, part of that is going to be due to the difficulties that just come along for the ride with any attempt to frame complex philosophical questions in a way that non-philosophers will recognize that basically philosophers, because they don't have to be philosophers, they can be psychologists. When you're asking a question about whether a person endorses realism or anti-realism, you're asking it in a way where the philosophers and the researchers conducting this research aren't realizing that those questions are most readily interpreted within a specific linguistic community, because the context of the question helps the person parse the meaning. If you're asking, hey, do you think morality is objective or relative? Or do you endorse realism or anti-realism? To a professional philosopher, to your colleagues, they can parse that question. And not even 100% of the time, even in those contexts, but they'll probably parse that question much of the time in a way that you intend. But that language, basically you're using a lot of times ordinary language to convey highly technical and like specialized specific narrow meanings. But when you're framing those questions to non-philosophers, even if you're trying to frame it without the use of all the fancy language, you're trying to get at a particular concept, a philosophical concept. It's very difficult to ensure that when you don't use the technical language, you don't have to try to translate what you're asking them into colloquial ordinary language. You're not guaranteed to succeed at that translation. And so when you're asking the person these questions, often the questions are too underspecified. I mean, there's a reason why philosophers develop all the technical language in the first place. It's in order to be specific. Are you a moral realist? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, do you think that there are stance-independent moral facts? Yes, I do, or no, I don't. There's a reason we developed that language. It's so we can be precise. But when you ask a participant, hey, because this is the typical way that philosophers and research, well, so I keep saying philosophers, people researching folk metaethics will ask the question this way. If two people disagree about a moral issue, do you think they could both be correct, or do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? And the person says, at least one of them has to be incorrect. It does not entail that that person is a moral realist, because we need to know, how is that person interpreting that question? And if they're not interpreting it in a way where that answer is diagnostic of their view on whether or not there's stance-independent moral facts, it's not a measure of whether they're a moral realist or not. At least it's not a good measure. And I think that problem generalizes to the methods used throughout the field of psychology and metaethics. Now, there is I think, a much stronger study from Polzer and Wright. I mention it all the time, that anti-realist pluralism paper. And what they do is they go out of their way to try to minimize the amount of conflations and ways that participants could interpret the questions in a way inconsistent with the researcher intent. And they give the participants a sort of richer, more contextualized response options that are broader, more representative of the range of meta-ethical views. They do a bunch of stuff to try to minimize these problems. But my concern is that it's kind of a catch-22. So they have this issue where either those methods of trying to get people to understand are inadequate, in which case the measure remains invalid because we don't know whether the participant understands, or they succeed, in which case you now have effectively trained the person a bit too much in philosophy, and they're now basically like a novice philosopher. And so now, if you know what a novice philosopher thinks about that issue, well, can you generalize from a group of novice philosophers to non-philosophers? No. So what you have to worry about is changing the participants too much in the process of them participating in the study. If your goal is to say, what do people without philosophical training think about this issue? You can't take a group of people, train them in philosophy, ask them, and then know the answer because you've trained them in philosophy. That doesn't work. So my concern is that it's one or the other, and neither of those solutions is going to help a whole lot. I do think that those studies are a lot more methodologically careful than previous ones, though. And by the way, if you don't know the results of those studies, they found that about 3/4 of the participants consistently favored anti-realist positions. So this is one of the primary lines of evidence I point to, not because I think most people are anti-realist, but because when you actually do these studies and you do them well, you don't get this evidence that most people are realists, at least for a couple of the studies. Taylor Davis also has a study where I think, I can't remember the proportion, but you had a very high rate of anti-realism. In that case, what's different is very high rate of non-cognitivism specifically, whereas the Polzer and Wright had mostly people endorsing some type of relativism, either cultural relativism or individual subjectivism. Okay, again, I started talking about too much stuff. Let's see. Oh, cool. Love your channel. Oh, thank you. Know you from the Landau-Kane debate. Was I in the comments or something? I don't know. Maybe I left comments there. I don't remember that. I don't think I wasn't talking in that. I think that was them talking. Okay. All right. Going through a lot of people talking to each other, so I'm skipping through those. All right. Question for Lance. Suppose there are intellectual seemings. One second. I see someone saying now, can we come onto the stream? I will check because I have to see if because it's been a long time now. I need to see if I could stay. So give me a few minutes. I'll try to move through the questions more quickly and then get to that. And then I'll see if I still have time what would you want to talk about? I don't know if I'll have time or anything like that. But we could see. Okay. Anyway, let's see. Okay, so suppose there are intellectual seemings and they defeasibly justify believing their contents. Do you think intuition disagreement is a defeater for the seemings? No, I don't. I don't think that's an interesting question, though. If someone thinks that it would be, I'd be curious about why they think that. Basically, I would take this sort of Bayesian view where I take everybody believing anything is some degree of evidence for it. And then there's going to be a bunch of factors weighing how much. So like if a bunch of philosophers think it, so if someone has training in philosophy, I would probably take that to be a bit more evidence that the thing in question is true. And then if they don't have training, I might take it. It's going to depend on a biologist. I'm going to take their word or how things seem to them on matters of biology more seriously. So, you would weight other people's judgments and I would assign differential weight. So two people run out of the woods, a person I trust very much saying they saw Bigfoot, I'm going to assign greater evidence to that than someone I've never heard of before, or someone with a history of Bigfoot hoaxes. I'm not going to take them very seriously. But other people's judgments and intuitions, I do take to be evidence. It's going to be variable evidence based on a bunch of background considerations. I guess you could say that that's a defeater, but it's just a question of, yeah, okay, so let me walk that back. I guess it's going to depend on how you frame defeaters. I'm going to take it, so this is why I don't like this defeater language. I would take it to be some evidence that you're wrong, that another person has a contrary intuition, but I'm not going to take it to be, typically, if I have an intuition in favor of something and someone else has a contrary intuition, I'm typically going to trust my intuitions more than their intuitions, unless there are additional reasons why I should think their intuitions on the matter are more reliable than mine. So I could imagine, for instance, let's say, I don't know how you would do this, but I have an intuition. This would be a good chess move, but I'm not really trying to look ahead and anticipate reactions. Just I'm trying to make like I'm playing speed chess and I have an intuition. I should move the pawn this way. And then someone could pause the universe like a chess master and say, well, my intuition is that you should, and they're like, look, I really don't know the correct answer. Like I only have 2 seconds to think about this. You should go that way. I'm going to trust their intuition more than mine. Maybe that's a weird scenario. I don't know. I and another person are trying to make a decision about some matter where the answer is not obvious to us. They're an expert in the topic and I'm not. I'm going to trust their intuition more than mine. I would take their intuition to the contrary to be a defeater. So I guess you could say it could be a defeater. It's going to depend on background considerations. So I would say conditionally, yes. There's my answer. All right. You're not asking me, I guess. Let me see. Sorry, just looking through these. Looks like mostly people talk to each other. I'm going to move down a bit more. Is it fair to say you're presupposing reliabilism in order for your criticism of intuition being used as evidence of philosophy to be valid? Maybe. That might be a longer discussion. I don't know if I'm presupposing it. I mean, I might be presupposing it at like one level removed, but then that presupposition might be based on background considerations that are themselves like so. To say that I'm potentially presupposing a particular epistemic approach isn't to say that I don't necessarily have further arguments, justifications, reasons, or things I could offer for why one ought to endorse that view. But it might be that if I'm making some sort of a local claim, that claim is presupposing some background position that would be something like reliabilism. Maybe it's going to depend on the particular, because like I don't know that I'm going to endorse reliabilism. Probably not. So I would probably endorse some type of empiricist epistemic framework that would probably be cashed out in something that would look more like some classical pragmatist perspective. But I'm not familiar enough with epistemology to even be able to tell you really whether I would consider myself a reliabilist or not. Yeah, I think we might need shorter answers in general in order to get through more questions in chat. I agree. Okay, Lance seemed to be saying that only cognitivists are error theorists and naturalists and non-naturalists. There are tons more. Right. So what I was describing was Hume's characterization, which is that there's 5 categories. I don't endorse that grouping. I was describing someone else's grouping. So yeah, I agree that there's more. So Hume is not like downplaying and isn't unaware of the existence of constructivism. I think that the constructivist accounts are either going to fall into some realist account or some anti-realist account that fits into that typology. So, for instance, some of the some type of like Humean constructivism would probably fall into the subjectivist account. that category. So if someone says, yeah, but that's not really subjectivism, it's his own view. I agree. And so maybe we would need some other terminology, but it's not my terminology. All right. I think I'm almost caught up. All right, so I'm caught up. I am going to take a quick break and check on what's going on outside this room, and I will be back in a few minutes. If you have other questions, I will try to get to them. I did find myself starting to move through the questions a little more quickly. Okay, so I'll be right back. All right, I am back. I can keep going. All right. So I don't have. I just see this question. Can we come onto the screen? I don't know if you're still around. Um, oh no, there's a typo in the title. Oh, I just noticed it says conservatism and it's missing a V. I have to fix that. Okay. Oh wait, no, it's not. It's not mistitled. Never mind. Oh, I must have mistitled it when I set it up on StreamYard. Okay. Anyway, why am I thinking out loud? Um, so, all right. I don't see a response, so I might wrap things up there. So I did this big break, and then I come back, and then there's not any more questions. Oh well, that'll be a weird end to the stream. Yeah. So today took an interesting angle. I do think one of the things I feel like I've stressed here is a difference in my education approach and background, and I think that that's influenced me towards having a different approach to addressing philosophical questions. And one of the things I've noticed about myself is that oftentimes I'm forgetful of particular things, and I often have this kind of like, for instance, someone asked me about reliabilism, and I'm like, well, I took courses on epistemology, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. It's the kind of thing where there's so many categories and distinctions, and so much knowledge a person can have. And I remember having professors. Like I had this particular professor that just, no matter what topic I brought up with him, they could always just talk fluidly. They knew all about my interests in experimental philosophy and that sort of thing. I mean, they didn't know everything. There was stuff I knew that they didn't know, but they could speak really well and insightfully on the topic. And then if I brought up, Eric, what do you think about Epicurus? They could speak insightfully on that. And they just seem to have this encyclopedic knowledge of so many things. And I honestly, I really envied that, because it's not something I ever developed. I never developed this ready capacity for just reading books, knowing what's in them, and I move on. And now I know that. I've noticed, people will say, hey, do you remember that line from that movie? And they'll quote some movie that I saw. They'll quote a movie from when I was 12. And I'm like, no, I don't remember. So I'm often concerned that I tend to forget a lot of the terminology and that sort of thing if I don't use it. And that puts me at a big disadvantage, because, I've been studying psychology for so long that my knowledge of, especially like metaphysics and epistemology, was never super magnificent to begin with, but has only deteriorated since I went off into the world of psychology. And it bothers me. I'd like to be able to say, yeah, this is where I fall within the framework of these various categories and distinctions. One thing I have found, though, is that when I have done a deep dive into looking at the categories and distinctions, which, like in philosophy, one of the only cases where I've really done this is with the sort of conventional metaethical views. So like non-cognitivism, error theory, subjectivism, naturalism, non-naturalism. And really, for me, a lot of it is focused on non-naturalist realism, error theory, and subjectivism, more so than the other ones. I think a lot of people are interested in these various expressivist accounts. But for instance, I haven't read a ton of stuff on quasi-realism. I couldn't tell you a whole lot about it. And that bothers me. I would like to be able to do that. I'd like to have this super duper encyclopedic knowledge of all the positions, and like just be able to just say, well, this is what Blackburn thinks, and this is what this person thinks. And it's just not what I've studied. So I spent years and years and years studying, so I've read some things. There's snippets and pieces of things. I could tell you a bit about what Joyce thinks, for instance. But I spent so many years studying like psychological research. So, I was doing projects in psychology, a lot of it quite a bit different from what I'm doing here. And it put me out of the loop for a while. And, I'm going to have to dig back into it. Right now, some of the recent stuff I've been reading. So like I said, I was reading Pragmatism. I read Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. I'm working through that still. I should really finish one of those before I get through the other. So a couple of those. What did I read? I started reading. What is it called? I just mentioned it before. Philosophy Within Its Bounds. Or maybe it's Proper Bounds. Let's see. Yeah, Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. I just started reading that. But you could see all that's, it's all pragmatic, it's all meta-philosophy, all of it. I really got to grab, really sink my teeth into like Schaefer-Landau's work, more Mike Humer's work, and not just read the articles. I'd like to get through some of the big books and really dig into that stuff. Maybe at some point I should really try to read a lot of Parfit's work. I've read the sections in On What Matters that discuss like a lot of that stuff, but not enough of it. I don't think, not anywhere near enough of it. So, if someone says, hey, read this section or read these few pages, that's a very large volume. So there's just so much work for me to go through that I haven't gone through. And so there's a lot more work for me to do. On the other hand, I do think that when I see people characterize these topics and discuss them, like for instance, you'll see people say, these are people that are professional philosophers. A lot of times it's not professional philosophers, but basically, so people say stuff like this. When anti-realists go around, making moral claims, it's a performative contradiction, or they're making a mistake. Because how could they go around condemning other people if they don't think there's moral facts? It's ridiculous. Of course, you could condemn other people without having to think that moral realism is true. You can just condemn other people. There's no logical contradiction in that. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, and there's no inconsistency. So, you can make this comparison. So I've asked people before, because people will say, oh, well, if you're for instance, a moral relativist. Now, I'm not a moral relativist, but I see so many awful criticisms of relativism where people will say, for one thing, and I see, again, this is sometimes professional philosophers doing this. So I don't know if they've read everything from, Schaefer, Landau, and they've read every textbook and they've read all this stuff, but then they'll go in ahead and say stuff like, relativists, relativism is absurd because if you're a relativist, then you think that the statement, it's okay to murder babies, is true. That's a unbelievably misleading way of framing what a relativist is committed to. First, it doesn't draw a basic distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. And sometimes critics of relativism will say that the relativist is committed to thinking baby torture is good, provided at least one person thinks it's good. What does that even mean? This nonsense. It's so underspecified. It's unclear what that could mean when a realist says that. Are they talking about agent or appraiser relativism? Because if you're an appraiser relativist, you think that the standard of evaluation for whether an action is right or wrong or something's morally good or bad turns on the standards of the agent appraising the claim. And so let's say I'm an appraiser relativist, and I think murder is bad, I think baby torture is bad. So now you tell me I have to think baby torture is good because that person over there thinks it's good. What do you mean? I think that person thinks that it's good. So if I'm an appraiser relativist, I'm going to say something like this. I think that the proper semantic analysis of ordinary moral claims is that they have implicit indexicals such that those statements are true or false relative to the standards of the person making the appraiser of the claim. And so typically it's going to be the person making the claim. Like if someone says murder is wrong, they're expressing their standards. So if a person over there says that they think baby torture is good, what I would take them to mean as an appraiser relativist is, baby torture is consistent with their moral standards. So now when you tell me that I have to think that because that person said baby torture is good, or it's not morally wrong to torture babies or whatever, baby torture is good, or baby torture is morally permissible, whatever you want to go with. Because they said that, and I'm a relativist, I have to think baby torture is good. What do you mean? What I think is that what they're saying, because basically what the appraiser relativist does translates the statement. So what that person says amounts to that. Let's say it's this person, Alex. Alex says it's morally good to torture babies. What I take that person to mean is it is consistent with my standards, Alex, it's to torture babies. Well, provided it is consistent with Alex's standards, that is true. And not only is it true, it's trivially true. Of course, it's consistent with their standards. It'd be just as true as if someone who likes chocolate ice cream says, I like chocolate ice cream. That statement's true. It's indexical. And assuming they do like chocolate ice cream, it's true. It doesn't mean, if someone says, I like chocolate ice cream, do I have to think chocolate ice cream is good? What do you mean? I might have to think they think it's good. That's all I'm committed to. But I don't have to think it's good simpliciter because I don't believe in good simpliciter. That's the whole damn point. So what the hell do they mean when they say that relativists have to think that baby torture is good if someone else thinks it's good? No, they don't. That's just a mischaracterization of the position. It's ridiculous. And I see this over and over and over. So it doesn't matter how many books people read, if they have such an animus towards views they don't like, that they just straw man them and mischaracterize them. And this is exactly what I see people doing all the time. And it doesn't matter if they have 1,000 PhDs. That is a misleading way to talk. Be clear. And they're not clear. They're not clear about what they mean about these things. And you see this over and over and over. If you're a relativist, you have to think baby torture is good. No, you don't. Because what are they implying there? If they're saying you have to think, well, first of all, to take a step back. So I talked about appraiser relativism. If you're an agent relativist, you might say that the locus of moral evaluation is the standards of the agent performing the action. So then you might be committed on certain accounts of agent relativism to think that if a person thinks baby torture is good, then it is good in a way that it's like good for them to torture babies according to your standards. And then you would think baby torture is good. But let me just show you. Moral Relativism, Stanford Encyclopedia. Some people will cite this a little too much and they'll treat it like it's like the Bible of philosophy and you have to trust anything it says. That's not true. These are all typically written by one, maybe a handful of authors. They often reflect as much as, they're pretty good, but they're not, always 100% accurate. But take this remark from, I'll post it in the chat, from the article on moral relativism. I'll pin it for you. All right. And if you go, what section is it in? 2, forms and arguments. And here you'll find this. It's probably going to split this up into several posts, but I'll just read it for you. Okay. That to which truth or justification is relative may be the persons making the moral judgments or the persons about whom the moral judgments are made. These are sometimes called appraiser and agent relativism, respectively. Appraiser relativism suggests that we do or should make moral judgments on the basis of our own standards, while agent relativism implies that the relevant standards are those of the persons we are judging. Of course, in some cases, these may coincide. Note the next remark. Appraiser relativism is the more common position, and it will usually be assumed in the discussion that follows. So the appraiser relativist does not have to think that if someone else thinks that baby torture is good, that they themselves have to think baby torture is good. They don't have to think that. They only have to think that baby torture is good according to that person, or it's good by that person's lights, but they don't have to be okay with baby torture. Now, when people characterize relativism, they'll imply is specifically type of agent relativism, not appraiser relativism, even though you see in the SEP, they say, and look, I don't know if this is true, appraiser relativism is the more common position. There's no citation for that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know how many philosophers endorse relativism. It wasn't even included as an option in the 2020 Phil paper survey, as far as I know. It wasn't even given to people as an option. But among those people that would say that they're relativists, how many are appraiser and how many are agent within philosophy? I don't know. We don't, as far as I know, we don't have a measure of that. But they seem to take it to be the case that appraiser relativism was more common. So why, when people characterize relativism, do they characterize it as if all relativists are agent relativists? Why? Well, there's an obvious reason why, because it makes relativism look bad. It makes it look like relativists are evil idiots that think that if as long, and then they'll say stuff like, yeah, so if you're a relativist, you think that if some person over there who's a total, depraved evil person thinks it's okay to torture babies, you have to be okay with them torturing babies. And then they'll say stuff like, if you're a relativist, you can't object to other people doing that. Like if someone wants to steal your wallet, what objection could you have? They think it's good to steal your wallet, so you don't have an objection. Nonsense if you're an appraiser relativist, because the appropriate locus of moral evaluation, if I'm an appraiser relativist, they're my moral standards. And my moral standards don't have to apply just to me. I could think everyone should be against wallet stealing, including the person trying to steal my wallet. And I don't have to approve of them stealing my wallet. And so the problem is that for all the training and success and education and publications that people working in this field have, what you see is people routinely mischaracterize and disparage people that hold contrary philosophical views. In meta-ethics, they do this by making really, really misleading remarks about anti-realist positions. So they'll say stuff like, if you're an error theorist, then you don't think baby torture is bad. You don't think it's bad. Now, there might be a certain strained sense in which that's technically true if you're an error theorist. You don't think baby torture is morally bad if you're an error theorist. Why? Well, because you think what it means for something to be morally bad is that it's objectively morally bad. You don't think anything is objectively morally bad. But on the other hand, when someone says, hey, yeah, you error theorist, you don't think baby torture is morally bad. What does that imply about the person? That they don't disapprove of baby torture, that they're not against baby torture, that they don't find baby torture repugnant, that there isn't some sense in which they are normatively, it's against some normative standards that they have. They just don't endorse moral standards, specifically this characterization of morality. So you're implying that the person is some sort of depraved monster that's indifferent to baby torture, which I've never met an error theorist that would say, yeah, I don't think baby torture is wrong. And then someone's like, okay, well, should we torture this baby? They're like, I don't care. None of them would do that. They go, no, don't do that. And then what are the realists going to say? Aha, I gotcha. Performative contradiction. No, because there's no inconsistency between thinking something like this. Keep in mind what error theory is. Error theory is a semantic thesis and a metaphysical thesis that are fused together. So the error theorist thinks that when ordinary people say stuff like murder is wrong, those people are trying to make objective moral claims. And it's just that there isn't anything that those claims are successfully referring to. The same way people were talking about unicorns. The unicorns are the greatest. No, unicorns actually are terrible. They're really mean. Well, there are no unicorns. All those statements, unicorns aren't really mean and they're not the greatest. There are no unicorns. All the statements are systematically false. The error theorist thinks that about ordinary moral language. Does that mean that the error theorist can't find things repugnant, that they can't have attitudes about baby torture, that they can't say, stop torturing babies? No, they can issue imperatives. They can express attitudes. They can be against things. There's no contradiction in an error theorist saying, technically speaking, it's not morally wrong to torture babies, and I'm very against torturing babies, and I'll absolutely try to stop anybody that does it. There's no contradiction. And yet, when people characterize error theory, they will frequently frame it as though the error theorist is some type of evil monster, all because they don't agree with a metaphysical thesis that they think is implicit in the way other people are speaking. Why would that follow? That's ridiculous. And yet people do this routinely. How did philosophers just not notice they're doing this? Oh yeah, because they focus only on semantics and they don't care about pragmatics. And so they haven't noticed that normative entanglement has been used. First of all, what's worse if they do notice? So if they know that they are basically engaged in character assassination of their philosophical rivals by deliberately implying that the rivals are a bunch of evil monsters that aren't against baby torture, that's even worse. But it's also bad if they're not aware of this practical implication of saying, oh yeah, you're an error theorist, so you don't think it's wrong to torture babies. Come on, you're going to tell me they're not noticing what effect that could have on an audience? If they don't notice, then I'm supposed to take people that are framing issues in this way to be this group of experts. And if I have to defer to their judgments on these issues, what have they done to earn that? What have they done? To me, is so many of these arguments, like when philosophers love to put arguments in these like standard little stupid syllogisms that are supposed to clarify. And what they actually do is the syllogisms are ways of basically hiding all of your presuppositions behind in the background. You're shuffling it all out of sight. You're sweeping it all under the rug, and you're giving people a syllogism, and you're forcing them to come categorically down on one side or the other. But the problem is that when you pack away all the presuppositions and all the underpinnings behind your argument, the arguments become almost inherently, almost necessarily ambiguous. One of the most common things you'll see when people are discussing metaethics is you'll see a back and forth. Again, these could be professional philosophers, but you'll see a back and forth, and you'll see someone, the realist could say to an anti-realist, well, do you have the intuition that baby torture is wrong? Oh yeah, I think baby torture is wrong. Well, objectively wrong, or in some non-objective way? Or is it like an undifferentiated normative judgment? What do you mean when you say you have the intuition that it's wrong? Do you have the intuition that it's wrong independent of anybody's goal standards or values? Or do you have the intuition that do you feel disapproval for it? What exactly is the intuition you're having? Because that sounds like a normative. So, if you're trying to figure out if a person's a realist or an anti-realist and you ask them, do you think baby torture is wrong? That shouldn't be diagnostic, because that is ambiguous between a realist and anti-realist reading. So what are you asking them? And yeah, routinely I see people having these discussions. They just make what look like normative claims. Now they could say, oh, well, if you're going to presuppose anti-realism behind the claim, that would be revisionary. Not at all, because keep in mind, we go right back to what professional metaethicists say about this stuff. They frame all of the standard metaethical views in terms of their semantic theses. So those, from the point of view of the people endorsing those metaethical positions, it's an open question. You don't get to presuppose an implicit realist semantics. What if the person's a non-cognitivist and they endorse a non-cognitivist semantics? Isn't that part of the definition of non-cognitivism? So why is it revisionary? If you're non-cognitivist, you don't think non-cognitivism is revisionary, not necessarily, unless you are a prescriptive non-cognitivist instead of a descriptive one. But oftentimes when people are talking about this, I don't know what are the accounts describing? Are they describing how people actually use the language? Are they describing some idealized type of language that's not even intended to accurately characterize it? It's not clear. So you have all these like deep lack of clarity in what the heck is even going on or what people are doing. It's really weird. And I think that filters down into the public discourse on the matter, where there's all types of mischaracterizations and misframings and ambiguities and distortions and people exploiting, I think unintentionally, I think because philosophers, I think, and just the discourse itself is so focused on the presumption that the meaning of sentences like murder is wrong. It's all about semantics, that they downplay the importance of pragmatics, even though, look, most people are familiar with the fact that subtext plays a role in how we evaluate other people and what they mean in everyday discourse. Why wouldn't this play a role in public philosophical debates or even private ones? But it's like philosophers are just insensitive to the fact that if you say a relativist has to think baby torture is good, that you're implying very, very strongly that that person is pro baby torture, or that they don't care if someone tortures babies, when that is not true, or not, at least not necessarily true, could be true, of an appraiser relativist. They could be very against baby torture. So you have these huge problems in the way that people discuss this topic. And I mean, most of the time I'm talking about public discussions. So this could be discussions on YouTube and elsewhere that I've seen people discussing these things. But oftentimes the people having these discussions are drawing on the philosophical literature. And unfortunately, the philosophical literature, I think, is insensitive or inadequately sensitive to the importance of pragmatics, to the importance of implication, to the importance of implying nasty things about the character of people that disagree with you. And this all crops up over and over and over in public discussions about this, with almost no sensitivity to this fact, no appreciation for it. And this creates this sort of framing bias against anti-realism, where people routinely frame anti-realists as if they are potentially evil people that don't care about human suffering or something. It's really, really bizarre. Being an anti-realist simply means you don't think there stands independent moral facts. It has nothing to do with your attitudes or about human suffering. It has nothing to do with how your kindness and compassion for other people or for non-human animals or anything. It doesn't have to do with that stuff. Now, someone could say, I reject the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics, and they collapse into one another. And actually, they're all okay. It's fine. You can have that view, but it doesn't mean that the anti-realist you're talking to has that view, and it doesn't mean that they are necessarily committed. It's not just because someone thinks, "Hey, P entails Q," like logically entails Q. Therefore, if you think P, you must think Q. No, that's how do you know that? You could say that it's a normative question, and you could hold the normative view that if you endorse P and that P entails Q, you ought to believe Q. You could say that, but whether or not people's beliefs entail that they have beliefs that are the entailments of those, that's an empirical question about human psychology. Human psychology doesn't necessarily have to conform to a particular person's perspective on the way logic works. It's absurd. Why would it have to function that way? And again, maybe it functions that way, but again, that is an empirical question. And what I see over and over and over and over and over is that philosophers that have not engaged with the appropriate empirical literature make empirical claims, and then sometimes they vacillate or will say that they're not making empirical claims, and then it's not clear what they're claiming, or they'll claim that their armchair methods are sufficient for making empirical generalizations without knowing whether that's true. Whether that's true is an empirical claim. How do you know whether your generalizations are accurate unless you did work to demonstrate that? So, I think that there are really serious metaphilosophical problems with much of the discourse in metaethics, and probably very much, but again, I don't read that much of it outside of metaethics. And it really, really troubles me that I think that we're dealing with a field that has pretty significant methodological problems. And I don't think it's in a position where people could say, hey, a little less than 2/3 of the philosophers endorse position A rather than position B. So you better endorse position A. It's nowhere near a state within the field where it's not just a matter of what proportion of philosophers endorse a view. It's also a matter of whether it's on sufficiently well-established and clear methodological footing where it's in a position to even say the proportion, that the majority proportion is likely to be right. I don't even think that's been established. And you could look outside of the consensus on metaethics and you get a very different picture. Look at their responses on like, I don't know, Newcomb's problem and some other sorts of topics. Are you going to agree with what the majority thinks there? Maybe, maybe not. So, we're going to have issues. One of the things I'll point out, if someone wants to say that, for instance, the specialists really matter. Okay, well, majority of specialists in philosophy or religion are theists. Is that really good evidence of theism? I think some people might go, well, yeah, but I think that there's sufficient defeaters, there's sufficient evidence to the contrary to weigh against that. But I just don't think it's sufficient evidence in the first place. Do people forget what selection effects are? Look, you want good evidence of Catholicism? Well, why don't we go ask a bunch of Catholics? Hey, Catholics, do you guys endorse Catholicism? Yes. Wow. Well, what proportion of Catholics endorse Catholicism? 100%. Is that good evidence Catholicism is true? No, because obviously what makes the people members of the category is the fact that they're Catholic. So in that case, it's just defined by the category. But in the case of philosophy of religion, it's not like you're only a philosopher of religion if you're a theist. But so long as the field attracts people that are more likely to be theists or are more disposed towards theism when they enter the profession, it's the fact that most of them are theists is not particularly good evidence of that theism is true. Because what ultimately is going to matter is why they endorse theism. And in the question, and so, and if they endorse theism because they endorsed it for reasons that had nothing to do with studying philosophy, then we're not in a position to say that in virtue of the expertise, knowledge, and skills one acquires by becoming a professional philosopher, one gravitates towards theism. Turns out that that's probably not true. In fact, it probably causes people to become atheists to a greater degree than it causes them to become theists. Obviously, not everybody. A lot of people are theists and have had lots of training in analytic philosophy. But the point there is just that, if 80% of the people that started out studying philosophy of religion are theists, and at the end 60% are theists, how would that be evidence of theism? It's a majority of theists. Yeah, but studying it actually caused 20% of them to become, in fact, probably more, because a few would cause be caused to become theists, but then like let's say 5% become theists and then 25% become atheists, and so it comes out as 20% lower rate of theism. So actually, it caused a quarter of them to become atheists. So how is that evidence of theism? It looks like studying philosophy makes you an atheist. So what, a lot of times, for instance, just consider this, what if 80% of the population are moral realists and only 62% of philosophers are realists? Well, then what does studying philosophy professionally cause 18% of people to become anti-realists? How is that evidence of realism? The base rate matters. You can't just look at the total proportion. It's over 50%. We win. You have to look at what the field is doing to the people that study the field. Now, I'm not convinced. I actually think it probably is increasing realism. But the point just is that what people are doing is they'll just lazily appeal to the proportion without considering all of these background factors, selection effects, the causal effects that the field is having on people, why it's having the causal effects. Are people becoming, what proportion of people are becoming realists because of social and cultural factors rather than because of good arguments? I'm not going to say it's most of them. The arguments are terrible. I'm not saying that. I'm saying no one's even seeming to address this. It's just, well, most of them are realists, so that's evidence of realism. What? Did you just not think about the 50 other reasons why more people might be realists? And this is really common with people pointing to, various sorts of, well, I'm not going to get into that. It's too much of a digression. Yes. So Joyce does make this point. So there's this great, I think it's from the 2007 version of the SCP article when it was like a supplement to the main article on moral anti-realism. And what Joyce does is, this is actually where I got that distinction. So I used to just treat relativism as a form of anti-realism. But now I was convinced by that passage from Joyce. It's just like one paragraph. I think Joyce got rid of that paragraph, got rid of the supplements, and then has a more concise version that's in the current version of the SCP entry. But the original, I really, really, really like, and I've cited several times that original version when I've written papers and stuff. And in that passage, Joyce talks about how there's this, there's two different sort of continuums or poles that you could talk about. And so, one pole could be whether things are relative or not, and then or you could say whether they're indexicalized or not. And that framing of relativism being about indexicals is, I also got that from that exact passage, from that exact article. Right. So the two dynamics here are: do you think that when people are making moral claims, murder is wrong? Does that have an implicit indexical element or not? If it has an implicit indexical element, so by indexicals, I mean statements like I or me. So if I say I am Lance, it's true when I say it. When someone says it who's not Lance, it's false. And so that word I, the meaning varies in accordance with who the speaker is. So when I say I, I'm referring to myself. If you say I, you're referring to yourself. You're not referring to me. And so, this is another one of the goofy things. I don't think professional philosophers typically will say anything like this, but sometimes people will say, relativism is absurd because it's self-contradictory. Well, no, it's not, because if the view is that claims are implicit indexicals, do you think that because the statement "I am Lance" is true when some people say it and false when other people say it, that the statement "I am Lance" is non-relative? It's either objectively true or no. The statement is relative. It's relative to the speaker because of the word "I." Now, the relativist can treat moral claims as having this implicit indexical element. It doesn't have to be explicit. I got that framing from that Joyce entry. Now, the point then would be, when a person says murder is wrong, it's implicit in the claim murder is wrong, like, to me. And so now if I say murder is wrong to me, if it's wrong to me, that's true. But if someone else who doesn't think murder is wrong says murder is wrong, that means murder is wrong to me from that person's point of view. And if they don't really think that, they're lying or something, then it's false. So the same statement can be true when one person says it and when false when another person says it, because of that indexical element. So relativism is about whether the indexical is there or not. Now that is conceptually distinct from whether or not the claim is made true by stance-independent considerations or stance-dependent considerations. And technically, you can relativize moral claims to something other than stances. And so it could be a stance-independent standard. And so in that case, it's hard to give examples of this sort of thing. I mean, you could come up with really weird ones. But the point there would be, the statements could have an indexical element, but they're relativized to standards that are not made true by people's attitudes or values or preferences or desires or anything like that, or the cultural consensus or whatever it is you want to use. It's not a stance. And in that case, it would be stance independent, but still relative. That's a type of realism. It's relativist realism. So you set that one aside. The converse is also true. So it's also true that you could have stance dependence without relativism. So Joyce calls these relation designating accounts. He cites an old work from like the 1950s, I think, or something like that. So that term has only come up in like 1 or 2 papers. I tried looking for it and I couldn't find a lot of other references, but I like the term relation designating. So you designate the relation. Now, imagine you had an account like this, some type of relativistic divine. Sorry, I shouldn't say relativistic. See, I already fell into the habit. So let's say you have an anti-realist divine command theory account where you say moral facts are made true by God's stances. Okay, well, now if someone says murder is wrong and another person says murder is wrong, there's no implicit indexical. They're all made with respect to the same standard. So the truth status can't vary in accordance with the speaker, and it's not relative to different sorts of considerations. There's one universal standard of truth, but that standard of truth is made true by a particular person, God's stance on the matter. And so that's what Joyce calls a relation designating account. So those accounts allow for the moral claims. It's an anti-realist account, but the moral standards don't vary in accordance with different speakers or cultures or appraisers or agents' standards or anything like that. So it's not subjectivism and it's not relativism, but it is stance dependent. And it doesn't have to be God. It could be an ideal hypothetical agent who is fully rational and fully informed. It's like whatever values that person would favor, that's whatever the values everyone should have. Still a stance dependent account. It depends on the stance of a hypothetical agent. You could have constructivist accounts where you say, here's a particular procedure, the standards that people would form under these particular procedural conditions. That's the moral standards we should favor. There's only one correct answer to that, but it still depends on a hypothetical group's agreement. So there's a variety of ways in which the standards could be made dependent on standards. There's only one standard. And so it's still anti-realist, but it's not relative. So that's the distinction. And yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Oh, right. Well, at least I feel like I came back and said a bit more. I am going to wrap it up there. I'm actually not tired, but I just feel like I'm out of steam. I don't know. Someone did want to talk to me. I felt bad about not bringing people in here. I keep saying I'm going to do that. I think I did it once or twice. But we'll be doing it at some point. Oh, cool. I missed some stuff. Okay. I'm going to go back and comment on that. Oh, right. So perhaps you once had intuitions in favor of more realism, but you forgot about them. That's actually possible. I'm not sure. For a while, well, I'm not going to get into all my other philosophical intuitions and all that. It's certainly possible. But yeah, if I did have them, I don't remember having them, but I also don't remember not having them. So I don't know if I ever had realist intuitions. I just don't know. And I've already commented on my terrible memory. So it's entirely possible. I was a realist for a long time and was like, I'm a realist and I'll always be a realist. And I just don't remember. I don't know. I think when I say that, I'm not saying I don't know. And also I don't think I did. I genuinely don't know. And I'm not very confident one way or the other about whether I had those intuitions. So maybe I did, maybe I didn't. And I think it's pretty plausible that I did have realist intuitions at some point. But it's also, and that might even be inconsistent with previous things I've said. I might have been more confident in the past and not really thought about it too much and thought very carefully through the matter. And I might have said, I've always been an anti-realist, or I've never had realist intuitions. If I've said that, that wasn't true. I don't actually know that that's true. As far back as I can remember, I could put it this way. I don't remember having them. And I do remember thinking and talking about this pretty early in my college education and not having realist intuitions at the time. But I don't know how far back that goes. So it's a long time, but I don't know how far back. So yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's actually quite plausible. All right. In his debate with Humor, Don Loeb said we should only trust the way things seem when the best explanation for what they are seen a certain way is that they really are that way. Any thoughts? I would need to see I've listened to that discussion. So that's a discussion, I think, on Majesty of Reason. And that didn't seem that much like a debate to me. I guess it was a debate, kind of, between Humor and Loeb. Yeah, so it looks like it's some type of inference to the best explanation or abductive inference or something like that. I generally am very inclined to reason and heavily in accordance with that. So that sounds pretty. I can imagine someone just saying it doesn't seem to me that we should reason that way. So there could be some sort of issue that it's just someone could appeal to a higher order epistemic principle where they're like, but it doesn't seem to me that that's true. So I don't know how one would demonstrate that that's true. It might be something one could accept as some sort of axiom or something. But yeah, I would have to see the fuller discussion context to really comment on that more. It's again, to go back to my terrible memory, I've listened to that discussion now, I think 2 or 3 times, and I probably wrote comments on it, and I have no idea what I wrote in those comments. So yeah, I just don't remember. But yeah. Okay, that's going to do it for me. Thanks everybody for being here. I did another super long one where I got almost to 4 hours. Can't quite do it. And cool. Okay, so I will see everybody next week. I got a couple more of these planned, and then I got to come up with some new content. So cool. All right. So thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. Please, if you get a chance, do like, subscribe, do all that stuff. I really appreciate feedback and comments on the channel. If you've got criticism, if you've got objections, if you've got positive comments, I want to hear from you. I love to see discussions going on in the comment section. I try to read all of the comments that I get, even if I don't always engage with everybody. Sometimes I'm just so busy with other stuff. I know if I start trying to get in a conversation, I'm going to get too wrapped up in it. So, if I don't always comment on your doesn't mean that I don't appreciate it and don't like that you're commenting or that I agree or disagree. Also, I will like people's comments, even if I don't agree with them. So I really appreciate people's engagement. I don't, in a certain sense, I was going to say, I don't want everyone to agree with me. But I kind of want everyone to like endorse metaphysical, like I want to convince people of my views. On the other hand, it is a lot more fun when at least some people don't agree with me. So I do like when people disagree with me, but I do want to have like a positive and productive dialogue here. I really, I do feel these inclinations to get like angry about like the state of this particular field or that particular field, but I don't like when people with contrary philosophical views like get nasty. I don't like and mean to one another and disparage and be rude to one another. And I do sometimes feel like I might do that. And I don't want to do that. So I don't want to, I want to talk to people that are more realists and that favor a lot of the methods used by contemporary analytic philosophy. I really want to engage with them. I want to have productive conversations. I want to get to the bottom of these questions and these issues. And I suspect a lot of people that are working within the analytic tradition might be really dismissive of what I say. And that's fine. But I really hope people would consider not being, if they are, and I'm not saying people are often, happy to talk to me, but I see a lot of people, basically not being too friendly to one another. And I think we could do with a bit less of that. And and again, I'm not saying I'm not a part of the problem at times of being rude or frustrated with people that hold contrary views. But I really want to see realists and anti-realists engaging with one another more. And I would really like those conversations to focus more on getting to the bottom of these issues. And I think some of them are going to be methodological. But, I really want to see less of people saying, hey, if you're an anti-realist, then you're okay with baby torture. Having some highly strained semantic, like technically, verbally, you're committed to this sentence. I think that people that are saying those sorts of things really consider, if you said, hey, technically speaking, just imagine you're at a gathering of non-philosophers and you're describing your anti-realist friend, and let's say you're friends with them and you know they're a great person, you would trust them with your life. They're really trustworthy, good person. And you said, technically my friend, Dr. Lance, or whatever, over there, they don't think baby torture is wrong. How do you think these people would react? They go, what? What do you mean? Yeah, they don't think it's morally wrong to torture babies. Like, they think that if someone said baby torture is totally okay, they would go, yeah, I don't think that's wrong. These people are going to go, what? And that's your best friend, or you really good friends? What is wrong with that person? So would you be, well, hold on. All I'm saying is that they don't have the metaphysical view that there are stance independent moral facts that are, that there are irreducibly normative facts that are made true by considerations other than people's goal standards or values. That's all I'm saying. The person goes, oh, what the hell are you talking about? They're not going to understand you. Because what they would interpret you to mean is like, this person, they're going to interpret this person to have normative attitudes towards baby torture that are like an evil person. They're going to interpret the person to have certain sorts of psychological or attitudinal states that the person probably doesn't have, or else, you wouldn't be friends with and trust with your life a person that is like callous and malicious and has a violent temperament and is like, yeah, baby torture. That's not your friend. Your friend is someone that goes, well, I don't really believe in these like stance independent moral facts. I think that stuff's weird. I think that there are moral facts, but I'm an individual subjectivist or a constructivist. So, are you going to say, yeah, my constructivist friend is a monster that tortures? No, but just imagine the impact it would have on an audience to say, yeah, my friend over there, doesn't think baby torture is wrong. And what you mean is something that's like really pedantic and specific and language centric. To people, it sounds like you're saying that the person's like a monster. I think that's pretty clear. We could test it. But people do this and they don't seem to see the problem with this. I'm just baffled by this. How do you not see that you're making your opponent look like a monster in a way that is not philosophically or logically entailed by their views or their commitments? And I guess there'd be another problem. What if the person does think that? Well, then I think that they've got the philosophy wildly wrong, because it's not an entailment of error theory that you're indifferent to baby torture. It's just not. That's false. So then you would just have extremely mistaken views. So there's, it's puzzling to me that people continue to speak and describe other people's views in ways that clearly carry connotations and implications and these sort of pragmatic factors that it's not a good way to frame other people's point of view. And yet it persists. So, all right, I'm going to close it out there. Thanks everybody for being here, and I will see you all next week. Take care.